Cheyenne, Wyoming, the summer of 1888, and the sun was punishing. The foreman looked her up and down, slow and deliberate, a smirk cutting across his face. A fat broad like you belongs in the dirt, dragging a plow. Clementine didn't flinch, didn't break. She met his eyes with absolute calm and said, quiet enough to make every man in that yard lean in, I heard you, mister. Rust. Then she reached down, picked up the stone, and kept working. But right then, hoofbeats thundered through the gate. A scarred stranger hit the ground running, crossed the yard in 4 strides, ripped the whip clean from the foreman's hand, and stood between them like a wall. His voice came out low, then cracked across the yard like a rifle shot. Not on my ranch can a woman the whole world wrote off find dignity, purpose, and love on the wildest frontier in America. Stay right there, because this story is just getting started. The wheels hit Cheyenne at 2:30 in the afternoon. That was the first thing Clementine Vance wrote in her pocket ledger. Not the heat, not the smell of manure baking on the main street, not the way the stagecoach driver had avoided her eyes the entire 3-day journey from Denver. Just the time, the facts, the things that were certain. Stage depot, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Arrival, 2:34 p.m. Scheduled arrival, 12:00 p.m. Delay 2 Harrettes, 34 min. Cause, rear axle mud, Horse Creek Crossing. She capped her pen and tucked the small leather book back into the front pocket of her traveling bag. Wyoming in August was a different animal than Philadelphia in August. Back home, August meant thick, wet heat that crawled under your collar and stayed there. Here, the heat came straight down from above, flat and merciless, like standing under a magnifying glass. Someone aimed at the sun. The ground was pale, almost white in places, cracked open in thin lines that ran nowhere in particular. There were no trees to speak of, just a long, low row of wooden buildings, a water trough that needed filling, and a sky so blue it looked painted. Clementine stepped down from the coach. She did it carefully, the way she always did things in public, measuring each movement. The iron step was narrow. She gripped the doorframe with both hands and lowered herself to the ground. Her boots found the dirt. She straightened up, squared her shoulders, and looked out at Cheyenne's main depot yard. The driver was already pulling trunks from the roof rack. 2 men in canvas work pants stood nearby, watching the passengers unload. A woman in a yellow traveling coat was being embraced by a man Clementine assumed was her husband. A pair of children chased each other around the water trough, shrieking. Nobody paid those children much attention. They paid attention to Clementine. She was used to it. That didn't make it comfortable, but she was used to it. The glances that started at her face and then traveled downward, taking a slow inventory. The way people repositioned themselves, creating more distance than was necessary. A man nudged the woman beside him and muttered something low. She pressed her lips together and looked away, but not before she'd already looked. Not before she'd already decided what she thought. Clementine pulled her trunk to the edge of the depot platform herself. The driver had set it down without offering to help. She didn't ask him to. She'd learned a long time ago that asking for help gave people an opening to say no, in ways that were designed to humiliate, so she simply did things on her own and moved forward. Her dress was travel-worn and dusty, a deep brown cotton that she'd chosen specifically because it didn't show dirt. Smart. She was always thinking ahead, calculating the small things other people didn't bother to consider. Her dark hair had held up tolerably well under her bonnet, though several strands had escaped along the way. The heat pressed down on her like a hand on the back of her neck. She scanned the depot. The notice had said a representative from Broken Ridge Ranch would meet her. That was the agreement. She had a contract, signed by a Mr. Gideon Thorne for the position of household manager and bookkeeper. The letter had been formal and brief. It outlined her duties, her compensation $12 a month, plus board, and her start date, It had not, as far as she could tell, been written by a man who used many words when fewer would do. She approved of that. She pulled the folded contract from her bag and held it at her side. Then she waited. The depot yard slowly thinned out. Passengers dispersed. The children were corralled by their mother. The woman in the yellow coat left on the arm of her husband. The two men in canvas pants collected their parcels and disappeared up the main street. Even the driver finished his work and wandered toward the depot building, not once looking back. Clementine stood in the open sun and waited. She checked her watch. 10 minutes past her arrival. She made a note in the ledger. 2:44 p.m. No representative present, waiting. The sun moved in that slow, relentless way it has in open country, where there's nothing tall enough to interrupt it. The shade from the depot awning stopped about 4 feet short of where she was standing. She shifted once to the left, trying to catch the edge of it. No use. She was in full sun, and she knew it, and she stood there anyway, because moving back toward the building would mean admitting she was struggling. She wasn't going to admit that to anyone watching. And people were still watching, in the way that small-town depots always generate a few idle watchers. A man on the steps of the general store across the street. A woman hanging laundry on a line beside the livery. At 10 minutes before 3, she heard boots on the board platform behind her. Heavy boots. Deliberate steps. She turned. The man who approached her was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't been able to picture much from the brief contract letter. He was somewhere in his 40s, lean in the way of men who stayed lean by hard work, rather than by eating well. His face was weathered to a deep tan that started at his collar and stopped in a sharp line at his hairline, where the skin was paler from years under a hat. His mustache was thick and going to gray at the corners. He wore a cattleman's hat pushed back on his head, and his vest had a stain near the breast pocket that he clearly hadn't noticed or didn't care about. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately. Surprise, then appraisal, then the slow recalibration of whatever he'd expected against what he was actually seeing. He covered it quickly, pulling it back into something more neutral, but she'd caught it. She always caught it. He stopped a few feet away and looked down at the contract in her hand. "You Clementine Vance?" he said. "I am." He took the contract from her without asking, turned it over, checked the back. His eyes moved down the page slowly. Too slowly, she thought, for someone who was just checking a name. "Clementine Vance," he said again, like the name had two possible meanings, and he was deciding which one applied. "From Philadelphia." "That's correct." He folded the contract and tucked it into his vest pocket without offering it back. "I'm Hector Rust." "Ah," he said. "Foreman at Broken Ridge. Mr. Thorne sent me to collect you." He said it the way you'd say you were sent to collect a piece of furniture. Something to be transported from one location to another. Handled, delivered, set in a corner. Clementine looked at him steadily. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Rust." He didn't echo the sentiment. His eyes moved over her again. This time, not bothering to be subtle about it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's been told is a thoroughbred and isn't sure he believes it. "The contract says bookkeeping and household management," he said. "That's correct. $12 a month." "Also correct." He made a low sound in the back of his throat. A non-word. A sound that contained an opinion he hadn't quite decided to say out loud yet. "Mr. Thorne wrote that contract himself," she said. "So I imagine any questions about the terms are best directed to him." Hector looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and calculating. Then his mouth curved up at one corner. Not a smile exactly, more like the preview of one. "Wagon's out back," he said. "You'll wait here until I'm ready to go. How long will that be?" "Long as it takes." He turned and walked toward the depot building without another word. Clementine watched him go. She took a breath through her nose, slow and even. She noted the time in her ledger. 3:02 p.m. Foreman Hector Rust. Collected contract without returning. Manner, dismissive. Instructions, wait. She stood in the sun and waited. The minutes accumulated. The heat pressed down. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck, beneath her collar, at the crease of her elbows inside her sleeves. She kept her posture straight and her expression even. She thought about the account books waiting for her at Broken Ridge. From the brief description in the contract, the ranch was substantial cattle, some horses, a full crew of hands, more than 2,000 acres. A ranch that size generated serious financial paperwork, purchase records, payroll, inventory, supplier accounts, livestock valuations. She wondered how long it had been since anyone had applied real order to those books. Years, probably. These operations often ran on handshakes and memory longer than they should. She was good at finding order in disorder. It was, if she was being accurate about it, the thing she was best at. The figures came naturally to her, had since she was a child, sitting at her father's desk in Philadelphia, running her fingers along the columns of his business ledgers while he worked. He'd let her do the addition checks on his invoices when she was 7 years old. At 9, she'd caught a billing error from a fabric supplier that saved him $43. He'd laughed when she showed him, ruffled her hair, called her his little calculator. That felt like a very long time ago. She blinked and focused on the depot yard. It was now close to 4 o'clock. She made a note. 3:59 p.m., still waiting. Sun remains direct. Temperature estimated at or above 100 Fahrenheit. No offer of water or shelter from depot staff or foreman. She had a small canteen in her traveling bag. She'd been rationing it since Horse Creek, not knowing how long the depot stop would be. She allowed herself 3 careful swallows. The water was warm and tasted of the tin, but it was water. The general store across the street had a porch with shade. She could see it clearly. She did not walk over to it, because Hector Rust had told her to wait here, and until she understood the situation at Broken Ridge better, she intended to fulfill every instruction she was given to the letter. Not out of submission, out of strategy. You learn more about a place by watching it than by fighting it. Too early. At 10 minutes past 4, Hector came back through the depot door. He was chewing something, a toothpick, working it lazily from one side of his mouth to the other. He walked toward her without hurrying, stopped in front of her. "Ready," he said. She picked up her trunk by the handle. It was heavy. 3 weeks of clothing, her books, her personal ledgers, 2 reference texts on animal husbandry she'd picked up in Denver on a recommendation from a librarian, and a small framed photograph. She got a good grip on it and started toward the corner of the depot where he was heading. Hector watched her carry it, didn't reach for it. Around the back of the building, there was a wagon hitched to a pair of brown mares. Both horses were standing with their heads low, clearly tired. She checked their shoes automatically, as she approached a habit she'd picked up from a stable hand in Philadelphia who'd taught her to read a horse's basic condition at a glance. The near mare had some heat in her left front, but nothing alarming. They'd been standing in the sun too long. She lifted her trunk into the wagon bed herself. Took effort. She didn't show that. Hector climbed up to the driver's bench and took the reins without waiting for her. She climbed up the other side, settled onto the bench, and organized her skirts. He slapped the reins, and the mares started forward. They drove out of Cheyenne heading north, the wagon jolting on the rutted track. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of wheels on dry ground and the occasional call of a bird somewhere out in the scrub. The country was wide and empty and enormous in a way that Philadelphia never was. You could see the horizon from here, the actual horizon, all the way around, a clean line between the earth and the sky. It made her feel exposed. She thought that probably faded with time. Hector didn't speak for about 15 minutes. Then, without turning to look at her, he said, "Mr. Thorne doesn't know yet." She looked at him. "Doesn't know what?" "Doesn't know what you look like." He moved the toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. The correspondence was all through the agency in Denver. He put out a call for a bookkeeper. Agency sent your application. He accepted. A pause. He's going to have some thoughts when he sees you. Clementine turned her gaze back to the road ahead. I expect he'll see a bookkeeper who came recommended by the agency based on her qualifications. Hector made that low sound again. I've worked with accounts since I was a child, she said. I completed 2 years of formal study in commercial bookkeeping in Philadelphia. I have references from 3 businesses that I managed accounts for prior to this position. All of that was included in my application. Sure it was. Then Mr. Thorne made an informed decision. Sure, he dragged the word out slowly. Except Mr. Thorne was thinking he was getting a regular woman. She looked at him directly. I am a regular woman. He laughed at that. A short, dry sound. He didn't explain it. She turned back to the road and did not respond. She folded her hands in her lap and thought about the account books at Broken Ridge, the satisfying work of bringing columns into alignment, the quiet precision of numbers that always told the truth. She pulled out her ledger. She noted the time, the direction of travel, and estimated the distance from Cheyenne. She noted the condition of the road. She noted the names of the 2 horses she'd seen them, stamped on the harness rigging, Belle and Duchess. Hector glanced over at the ledger and said nothing. She wrote for several minutes, then capped her pen and looked at the Wyoming sky. It was enormous up here. She'd been told that back in Philadelphia. People who'd traveled west always said the sky was bigger, and she'd thought that was an exaggeration. Some poetic way of talking about open country. It wasn't. The sky genuinely seemed larger. It took up more space in her field of vision than anything she'd seen before. There were clouds in it now, stacked white towers building to the north, and they were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're free to take up as much room as they need. She watched them for a long time. 4:47 p.m., she wrote, traveling north-northwest. Approximately 18 miles from Cheyenne. Road, hard-packed clay. Moderate rut. Weather, clear. Building cumulus north. Wind southwest. Moderate. Horses. Tired but sound. Right front heat on Belle worth monitoring. She added one more line. Then looked at it for a moment before closing the book. Position, uncertain. Situation, manageable. They rode in silence after that. Hector and the woman beside him, the 2 tired mares pulling the wagon north through the vast and indifferent Wyoming afternoon. The ranch buildings appeared on the horizon at around 6 o'clock. First just a dark shape against the lowering sun, then slowly resolving into a cluster of structures. The main house, long and solid, built from pine and stone, a large barn to the east, a bunkhouse running parallel behind it, corrals along the south edge, and beyond them, the start of open grazing land that seemed to go on without end. Clementine leaned forward slightly on the bench. Broken Ridge Ranch. That was the name. She'd looked it up in a land records almanac she'd found at the Denver Library during her 3-day layover. Founded 1879. Owner, Gideon Thorne. Approximately 2,400 acres in the Fort Laramie district. Cattle primary. Some horses. Good water access from a creek running through the eastern edge of the property. Profitable from the land tax records, though not extravagantly so. Manageable, she thought. Fixable, if it needed fixing. Hector pulled the wagon around the main house and came to a stop in a wide yard between the house and the barn. He climbed down without a word and went toward the barn. She sat on the bench for a moment. Across the yard, the door of the bunkhouse was open, and 2 ranch hands were sitting on the step outside it, drinking coffee from tin cups. They looked up at the wagon. One of them said something to the other in a low voice. The other one looked at her and then down into his coffee. She climbed down from the wagon. She pulled her trunk from the bed, set it on the ground beside the wagon wheel, and looked around the yard. The main house was quiet. No one had come out to greet her. The 2 hands by the bunkhouse were watching now without trying to hide it. She straightened up and looked back at them steadily. One of them younger, raw-boned, with red-brown hair, looked away first. The older one, a gray-bearded man with a face like old barnwood, just kept watching her with an expression that was, she thought, more curious than unkind. He had deep-set eyes under a heavy brow and a stillness about him that felt different from the kind of stillness that comes from contempt. This felt like the stillness of a man who had seen a lot of things and was simply noting one more. She picked up her trunk and carried it toward the main house. Inside her pocket ledger, in the last entry she'd made during the drive, she'd written a single sentence she intended to hold on to. A person's worth is not a matter of other people's opinion. It is a matter of record, and records can always be examined. She stepped up onto the porch of the main house and knocked. No answer came from inside. The house was quiet. She tried the door. It opened without resistance onto a dim front room with a plank floor and a stone fireplace. A large pine table, 2 chairs, a rifle mounted on the wall, a lantern on a hook, a hallway leading deeper into the house. Clementine set her trunk inside the door and stood in the front room for a moment. Then she found her way to a room off the hallway that held a roll-top desk, 3 oil lamps, and a collection of wooden crates that she quickly identified with considerable professional interest as the ranch's financial records. Invoice bundles tied with string, account books with cracked spines, a cash box with a busted latch sitting on top of the crates, like it had been there long enough to become furniture. She set her lantern on the desk. She opened the nearest account book. The columns were a mess, numbers crowded together without consistent spacing, entries made in at least 3 different handwriting styles, dates missing, totals that didn't reconcile with the subtotals above them. A real professional disaster, this. She ran her finger down a column of figures, then back up. She found a discrepancy in the 3rd line she looked at, then another in the 7th. She sat down in the chair at the desk, opened her own ledger to a fresh page, and began to work. Outside, the sun finished going down over Wyoming. A coyote called somewhere out across the dark grazing land. The horses shuffled in their stalls. The hands in the bunkhouse settled in for the night. And in the small office off the hallway of the main house at Broken Ridge Ranch, Clementine Vance lit all 3 oil lamps, lined up her pen beside her ledger with careful precision, and got to work. She would not be judged by the heat she'd stood in today. She would not be measured by Hector Rust's slow, contemptuous eyes, or by the whispers at the depot, or by the long wait in the blinding sun designed to make her feel small. She had stood in that heat, and she had taken notes. She had ridden 2 hours in silence beside a man who wanted her to feel like a burden, and she had written down the name of every mile marker they passed. She had walked into this house without being invited, and she had found the room that needed her most. The numbers were waiting. She was here. That was all that mattered. She drew a clean, ruled line across the top of a fresh page and wrote the date, August 14, 1888. First accounting review. Broken Ridge Ranch. C. Vance, bookkeeper. Then she turned back to the crates, pulled out the next account book, and opened it. There was a great deal of work to do. She was ready. The rooster at Broken Ridge crowed at 5:15. Clementine knew because she was already awake, already dressed, and already 3 pages deep into the second account book when the sound came through the office window. She'd slept 4 hours on the narrow cot she'd found in the back room. 4 hours was enough. She'd trained herself to make do with 4 hours back in Philadelphia, during the long stretch when her father's debts had kept her up doing mental arithmetic until well past midnight, searching for numbers that might save something that couldn't be saved. The morning light came in thin and pale gold through the single east-facing window. Outside, she could hear the ranch beginning to wake. Boots on the bunkhouse steps, the low voices of men collecting themselves for the day. A horse stamping in the far corral. She kept her pen moving. By 7 o'clock, she had filled 6 pages of her own ledger with preliminary findings. The account books went back 4 years. In those 4 years, based on what she could see so far, the ranch had been steadily hemorrhaging money in ways that were almost too consistent to be accidental. Supplier invoices that didn't match delivery records. Feed bills paid twice for the same month. Payroll entries for workers whose names she couldn't cross-reference with any other document in the crates. She capped her pen, tapped it against the desk once. Then she heard the yard. The voices outside shifted. A man's voice, loud and carrying, and then a lower sound she couldn't make out. She turned in her chair and looked out the window. Hector Rust was in the center of the yard. He had his hands on his hips, and his hat pushed back, and he was looking at two of the ranch hands, who were standing a few feet off, both of them staring at the ground the way men do when they're trying to be invisible. Hector was talking at them with the particular rhythm of a man who was not asking questions, but issuing verdicts. Clementine watched for a moment. Then she turned back to her desk. 10 minutes later, she heard Hector's boots on the porch. He came through the front door without knocking. She heard him move through the front room, and then he appeared in the office doorway. He took in the sight of her at the desk, the account book spread open, her ledger full of notes. All 3 oil lamps burned down to their bases. He looked around the room the way a man looks at furniture that has been rearranged without his permission. "You been in here all night?" he said. "Since 6 yesterday evening, yes." He looked at the account book stacked on the floor beside her. "Those records are not for general handling. I was hired to manage the ranch's accounts," she said. "These are the ranch's accounts. You were hired to assist with bookkeeping, under my supervision." She looked at him. "The contract says bookkeeper and household manager. It doesn't specify that the work requires your supervision." Something in his face changed, a tightening around the jaw. He crossed his arms. "Mr. Thorne isn't back until this afternoon," he said. "Until then, this ranch runs through me. I understand." "Good." He looked at the desk again, looked at the crates. "Close those books and come outside. There's work to be done before Thorne gets back." "What kind of work?" He smiled at her then. It was not a warm smile, the kind that needs doing. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she closed the account book she'd been working from, capped her pen, and stood up. Outside, the morning sun was already climbing, and the yard was full of activity. 4 hands were working the near corral, running a young roan in circles on a long lead. 2 more were loading hay bales onto a flat wagon. The gray-bearded man she'd noticed last night, the one with the deep-set eyes, was repairing a section of fence along the south edge of the yard. He looked up when she came out and watched her with that same still measuring expression. Hector led her around the side of the barn to a rocky area along the east fence line. A pile of stones sat there, irregular chunks of granite and shale, rough and heavy. Beside the pile was a wooden wheelbarrow with a cracked handle. "This rock pile needs to go to the south field," Hector said. "Fence lines getting extended, and the posts need anchoring." She looked at the rock pile, then at the south field, which was a considerable distance across the yard, and past the barn. "You'd like me to move this rock pile," she said. "I'd like it done before noon." She picked up one of the stones. It was heavy, maybe 8-10 pounds. She looked at the wheelbarrow. The cracked handle was wrapped with a piece of burlap that was mostly unwrapped. "Mr. Rust," she said, "my position here is bookkeeper and household manager. I don't believe hauling rocks is within that scope. You believe wrong." He turned and started walking toward the barn. She set the stone back down. Around her, she was aware that several of the hands had slowed their work, watching. The man loading hay bales had stopped with a bale in his arms. The young red-haired one from last night was sitting on the corral fence, not pretending to be busy at all anymore. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up the wheelbarrow handles, winced at the crack in the wood, and began loading stones. She would not cry. That decision was made long ago, and it held here the same as anywhere. She loaded stone after stone into the barrow, settled into a rhythm, focused on the physical work of it, the weight and the motion, the hot scratch of granite against her palms. When the barrow was as full as she could manage, she gripped the handles and pushed. It was very heavy. She pushed it anyway. The yard dirt was hard-packed near the barn, but loosened as she moved south, and the barrow's wheel caught twice in ruts she had to rock it out of. Sweat was on her face before she'd gone 30 yards. The sun was full up now, and the temperature was already pushing past comfortable. She made it to the south fence, unloaded the stones at the base of the fence posts, turned around, and went back. She made 3 more trips before Hector returned. He came back out of the barn and stood in the middle of the yard, watching her come back from the south field. On her 4th return, there was a smirk on his face. Around the yard, more of the hands had stopped working. The gray-bearded man had set down his fence tools entirely. Hector walked up beside her as she reached for the next stone. "Get on your knees," he said. She stopped, looked at him. "Kneel down," he said, "and pick them up proper, from the ground. Stop lifting wrong." She understood then. He didn't actually need her to kneel. There was no functional reason. He was watching the hands watch her. He was making a point. She straightened up fully. "I will not kneel," she said. Her voice was even, quiet enough that the nearest hands had to lean in slightly to catch it. "I am completing the task you assigned. I will complete it standing." Hector's smirk vanished. He stepped closer, not threateningly close, but close enough that she had to hold her ground deliberately. "A fat broad like you belongs in the dirt dragging a plow," he said, loudly enough for the entire yard to hear. "Stop acting like you're too good for the ground." The yard went very quiet. The young red-haired hand dropped his gaze to his boots. The hay bale man set his bale down carefully. The gray-bearded man by the south fence was still his arms at his sides, watching. Clementine's hands were at her sides. The stone she'd been about to pick up was at her feet. She was sweating, and her shoulders ached, and her palms were roughed up from the granite. And Hector Rust was standing in front of her with 14 years of satisfaction in his face. She took one breath. Then she looked at him with absolute calm and said, "I heard you, Mr. Rust." That was all. She reached down, picked up the stone, and placed it in the barrow. Hector opened his mouth to say something else. The sound came from the north gate. Hoofbeats. Not just one horse, but moving fast. A hard gallop that hit the packed earth of the approach road with a rhythm you could feel in your chest before you heard it clearly. Every head in the yard turned. A dark horse came through the gate at full speed and pulled up in the center of the yard, hooves digging into the dirt and throwing up a pale cloud of dust that drifted sideways in the morning breeze. The rider swung down before the horse had fully stopped, boots hitting the ground with a solid crack, and straightened up. He was tall, not in a way that looked accidental, but in a way that had weight behind it. Wide through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with the kind of build that comes from years of actual labor rather than show. He wore a dark hat and a gray shirt and worn leather riding gloves, and he moved through the yard with the particular economy of motion of a man who never wasted a step. Then she saw his face. A scar ran across it from the left cheekbone to the right side of his jaw. An old, settled scar, pale against the weathered brown of his skin. It had the smooth look of a healed wound rather than a fresh one, but it was unmissable, and it changed the geometry of his face in a way that made people look twice. And a hard jaw beneath it, a straight mouth and dark eyes that were taking in the entire yard scene with rapid precision. His gaze moved from Hector to Clementine, to the rock pile, to the wheelbarrow, to the hands standing idle around the yard. He took all of it in within about 4 seconds. Then he walked toward Hector. "Thorne," Hector said, and his voice had shifted into something smoother, more careful. "You're back early. Good morning. We were just getting the new woman. I can see what you were doing." Gideon Thorne's voice was low, not loud. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. It carried across the yard in the silence, the way a single note carries across an empty room. He walked past Hector and stopped in front of Clementine. She looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the dust from the road still on his shirt. His dark eyes moved over her face, with an expression she couldn't immediately read. It wasn't the inventory look she was used to from strangers. It was something more direct than that, more focused, like he was looking at her and not at her body, which was a distinction she was acutely aware of because it was so rare. "You're Clementine Vance," he said. "I am. Did Hector assign you this work?" He did. Gideon turned back to Hector. Hector had spread his hands in a preemptive gesture. She needed to learn how things work out here, came in like she owned the enough. One word, flat as a stone dropped on a table. Hector stopped. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached out and took the coiled whip from where it hung on Hector's belt in one clean, unhurried motion. He held it at his side. "Hector," his voice was still low, still even. "How many years have you worked this ranch?" Hector's jaw worked. 14. 14 years, and in 14 years have I ever once put a member of this crew on their knees to haul rocks in the yard? Silence. Answer me. No, Hector said. No. Gideon looked around the yard. Every hand was watching. He let them watch. This woman came here to work as a bookkeeper and household manager. That is what she was contracted to do. That is what she will do. He turned back to Hector. Around here, rocks are for building homes, not for tearing down human dignity. His voice didn't rise, but it sharpened like a blade being drawn slowly. They said she belonged in the fields. He paused. His eyes went hard as flint. Not on my ranch. The words hit the yard like a thunderclap. The horses shifted in the corral. The hands went absolutely still. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Hector's face had gone a dark, mottled red. Gideon stepped back. "Collect your things from the bunkhouse," he said. "You're done here. I want you off this property before noon." "You can't," Hector started. "I just did." Gideon turned away from him, which was a dismissal more complete than any argument. He looked at Clementine. "Miss Vance, my apologies for what you endured this morning." A pause. "And from yesterday, based on what I can guess. There's no need to." "There is," he said. "Come inside. I'll show you the office, and we can go over what you need." "I've already found the office," she said. "I've been working since last night." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise. More like adjustment, like a man recalculating something. "All right," he said. He looked back at the yard. Barnaby, the gray-bearded man by the south fence, lifted his chin. "Boss, put Miss Vance's trunk in the east bedroom of the main house, and get someone to fix that wheelbarrow handle." "Already on it," Barnaby said, with the calm of a man who had been waiting to be asked. Gideon looked at Clementine once more. There was no fanfare in it, no ceremony. He simply nodded, once toward the house. "After you." She walked ahead of him across the yard. Behind her, she heard Hector say something low and sharp. Heard Gideon's response, 3 words, too quiet to catch. Then Hector's boots in the dirt, moving toward the bunkhouse. She did not look back. Inside the main house, Gideon led her down the hallway to the office. He stood in the doorway, taking in the rearranged crates, the open account books, her ledger full of careful handwriting, the 3 burned-down oil lamps. "You found some problems," he said. It wasn't a question. "I found several," she said. "I've only been through the last 2 years so far. But I can tell you already that there are entries in these books that don't hold up under examination." He was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" "I need another day before I can give you accurate numbers. But my preliminary reading suggests it's significant." He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. He was watching her with that same direct attention, not performing interest, but actually paying it, which was different. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The contract I signed in Philadelphia. The position was arranged through an agency in Denver, but someone here at the ranch communicated the original opening to that agency." She paused. "Do you know who handled that communication?" Gideon straightened slightly. "Hector handled hiring communications." She nodded. She filed that away and didn't say anything more about it yet. You need anything for the work? He asked. Another lamp, a fresh inkwell, and access to whatever correspondence files exist for supplier accounts. Barnaby will know where the correspondence is. He pushed off from the doorframe. Breakfast is at 7 in the kitchen. Ruth the cook left 3 days ago to tend to family in Laramie, so it's cold provisions for now. Help yourself. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. He was already partway down the hall. He paused and looked back. Gideon, he said. Then he was gone, and Clementine stood in the office with the account books and the burned-down lamps and the morning light coming in through the window, and she let out one long, slow breath. She pulled her ledger open to the next clean page. August 15, 1888. Foreman Hector Rust, terminated. Ranch owner Gideon Thorne, present. Assessment, situation significantly more workable than yesterday. Preliminary financial review. Continuing. She picked up her pen. Outside, the ranch went back to work. Old Barnaby appeared in the office doorway at 8:30 with a fresh oil lamp, a new inkwell, and a tin cup of black coffee, which he set on the desk without a word. He was a careful mover, unhurried, his boots barely sounding on the plank floor. He had the look of a man who had been tall once and had spent enough decades under heavy work to compress him down some. His beard was iron gray, thick, and he wore it trimmed square across the bottom in a way that suggested he cared about order, just quietly. Correspondence files are in that bottom crate there, he said, pointing with one gnarled finger at a wooden crate beneath the desk. Been there 3 years. Nobody's touched them since I put them there. She looked under the desk. The crate was there as promised. You put them there? She said. Hector had them in the barn. Barnaby's voice was dry and unhurried. I didn't think correspondence ought to live in a barn. She pulled the crate out and lifted the lid. Inside, a mass of folded letters, some still in their envelopes, some loose, packed in no particular order. What's your name? She said. Barnaby. Most folks add old in front of it, if that suits you. It doesn't particularly, she said. I'll call you Barnaby. He looked at her with those deep-set eyes. Suit yourself. He didn't seem offended. If anything, he seemed mildly pleased. You need anything else? Not right now. But I'll have questions later about the ranch operation, suppliers' inventory, staffing patterns, if you're willing. I've been on this ranch 11 years, he said. I know where most of the bodies are buried, figuratively speaking. A pause, mostly figuratively. She looked at him. That was a joke, he said. I understood. She allowed herself a small smile. I'll find you this afternoon, then. He nodded once and left. She turned back to the desk and opened the correspondence crate. The next 4 hours were some of the most focused of her professional life. What she found in those files made her pen move faster and faster across her ledger pages. Supplier invoices that matched the forged account book entries precisely. Letters from a feed merchant in Laramie, addressed to Hector personally, referencing payments received. A letter confirming a kickback arrangement for a cattle buyer, and buried near the bottom of the crate, folded small and stuffed inside a larger envelope, as though someone had wanted to hide it inside something else. A letter she almost missed. It was addressed to a man named Vance in Philadelphia. She picked it up and held it. Her hand was steady. She noted that consciously, made herself note it, because the steadiness surprised her. She unfolded the letter. It was dated 14 months ago. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she set it down on the desk and looked at the wall for a long moment. The letter was from Hector Rust to her father, Edward Vance of Philadelphia. In it, Hector laid out an arrangement. He had seen an advertisement her father had apparently placed in a Philadelphia commerce paper, a quiet, humiliating advertisement. She understood now, trying to find employment placement for a daughter who was becoming a liability. Hector had written to propose a specific solution. He would request a bookkeeper through a Denver agency. The agency would receive a recommendation letter from Edward Vance. His daughter would be placed in the position. In exchange for this service, Hector Rust would receive from Edward Vance the sum of $40, which her father would send in 2 installments. $40. Her father had taken $40 to ship her west under a false arrangement so that she would end up here, under Hector Rust's thumb, doing field work in the Wyoming sun. She sat with that for several minutes. Outside, the ranch sounds went on. A horse being worked in the corral, Barnaby's hammer on fence post, the low murmur of hands talking somewhere near the barn. All of it completely ordinary and completely outside the radius of what she was sitting with. Right now, her father was dead. He'd died 6 months ago, before she'd left Philadelphia, which was partly why she'd left. There was no money left, no house left, and no particular reason to stay in a city that had never been especially kind to her. So she'd answered the agency's advertisement and accepted the position at Broken Ridge and come west. She had believed her father had arranged the placement because he cared what happened to her. She put that thought in a box, put the box somewhere internal she could close. Then she picked up her pen and wrote, correspondence file, letter from H. Rust to E. Vance, Philadelphia, dated July 14, 1887. Document payment of $40 in exchange for facilitation of C. Vance's placement under exploitative labor terms. Cross-reference with hiring contract irregularities. Retain as evidence. She underlined the last 3 words. Her hand was steady. She kept working. By the time the afternoon light changed and came through the window at a lower angle, she had completed a preliminary audit covering the past 3 years of ranch finances. The total discrepancy she could document was significant. She wrote the number at the bottom of the page and looked at it. She heard boots in the hallway. Gideon appeared in the office doorway. He'd changed from his dusty riding shirt into a clean one, and he'd washed up somewhere, his face clean, dark hair damp at the temples. He looked at her, at the spread of papers, at her expression. You found something worse, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up at him. He was watching her face in that focused reading way he had. Several things worse, she said. The financial theft I can document and give you a precise number on by tomorrow. It's substantial. She paused. There's also something I need to show you separately. It concerns how I came to be placed here. He came into the room, fully then, pulled the other chair up to the desk, and sat down. Show me, he said. She placed the letter from Hector to her father on the desk, in front of him. He read it without a word. His face stayed still. He reached the end, then went back and read the first paragraph again. Then he set it down. He looked at her. I had no knowledge of this arrangement. I believe you, she said. Your contract letter was too businesslike to be part of a deception. And the specific terms Hector set up were designed to give him control over me, not to benefit the ranch. You believe me, he said, not repeating it for agreement, but considering it, just like that. I've spent most of today reading correspondence, she said. I can recognize a man's written voice by the end of a few pages. Your letter and Hector's letters don't read like the same mind. She looked at the letter on the desk. Different motivations. Entirely. A long pause settled between them. Then Gideon said, Your father. He died in February, she said. Her voice stayed level. Before I came west. I'm sorry. Thank you. She picked up her pen, set it down again. I had thought he arranged the position because he was concerned about what would happen to me after his death. He had no money left. I had no other family. A pause. Apparently he was concerned about something else. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. People do things that are beyond explaining sometimes. Things that can't be made right after. He reached up and touched the scar on his face without appearing to realize he was doing it. Just a brief, unconscious contact. You know that already. She looked at the scar. He let her look at it. He didn't move his hand or turn away. How did you get it? She said. She asked it quietly, not as an intrusion, but as a genuine question. He let his hand drop Arapahoe County, 1,882. Scouting assignment that went sideways. A man I was supposed to trust decided not to be trustworthy, he said it plainly. No dramatic weight, no performance of survival. Just the facts of it. Bullet grazed the cheekbone and took a piece going out the other side. That's why you left scouting? That's part of why. He looked at the desk. Most people see the scar before they see anything else. Been that way since. She understood that. She understood it precisely. Most people see my weight before they see anything else, she said. He looked at her. I walked into a room in Philadelphia 4 years ago to present an audit to a board of directors, she said. 3 of the 5 men on that board laughed when I came through the door, before I'd said a word. She paused. I presented the audit anyway. Found $3,700 in accounting errors they hadn't caught in 6 years. They hired me on a contract basis after that and told their associates not to laugh. A pause. They didn't apologize. But they stopped laughing. Gideon looked at her for a moment. That's a better ending than most stories. I've learned to make endings when nobody offers them to me. He was quiet again. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals, throwing a low red light across the desk. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening, the light changing from gold to copper through the window. You can stay, he said. I mean that as it sounds. Your position here is real. The terms of the original contract stand, minus Hector's interference. Whatever arrangement he made with your father has no bearing on how this ranch operates. She looked at him. I'm a good bookkeeper, Mr. Thorne. Gideon? Gideon? She corrected herself without embarrassment. I found 3 years of financial damage in one day. Given proper access and time, I can restore this ranch's records and build you a system that will hold. I know, he said. She blinked slightly. You know, I read your references. He said it as though it was the most obvious thing. Before I agreed to the hiring, the Caldwell Textile letter described you as the most precise financial mind they'd worked with in 20 years. That's not language merchants use casually. He stood up from the chair. That's why you're here. She looked down at the account book in front of her. She pressed her lips together once, a brief and private moment of something she didn't name. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. He meant it practically, not coldly. Just fix the books. He went out of the office. She heard him move through the house, heard the front door open and close, heard his boots on the porch outside, and then the sounds of him crossing the yard, speaking to Barnaby, the low exchange of 2 men who'd worked together long enough not to need volume. She turned back to the desk. She picked up her pen. Outside, the Wyoming evening deepened from copper to purple to a dark, wide, star-scattered black, and inside the office at Broken Ridge Ranch, 2 scarred people had done what scarred people sometimes do when they find each other in unexpected places. They had told the truth. It was a start. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Clementine barely left the office. Barnaby appeared every morning with coffee and whatever cold provisions were available, hard biscuits, dried meat, once a plate of beans that he'd heated himself on the kitchen stove, setting it on the desk without comment and disappearing again before she could thank him properly. He seemed to understand intuitively that she needed fuel and silence in equal measure, and he provided both without making an event of it. She worked through the account books in order, oldest to newest, building a parallel record in her own ledgers that laid out the honest financial history of Broken Ridge Ranch alongside the falsified one Hector had constructed. It was meticulous, demanding work, and she loved it. She loved the way a clean column of figures told a story without editorializing. Numbers were honest when people weren't. They sat on the page and waited for someone smart enough to read them. She was smart enough. By the evening of the 3rd day, she had the full picture. She sat back in her chair and looked at the final tally she'd written at the bottom of the last page. Hector Rust had stolen from Broken Ridge Ranch over a period of approximately 3.5 years. The methods were layered false invoicing, double billing, kickback arrangements with suppliers, payroll ghosts, fake workers whose wages went directly to accounts. Clementine had now traced to a bank in Cheyenne under a name she didn't recognize, but suspect was a Hector alias or proxy. The total she could document with certainty was over $2,000. With the amounts she could prove circumstantially, the real number was closer to $3,000 over 3.5 years, from a ranch that was working hard to turn a profit. She wrote that number with a straight, firm hand and underlined it. Then she sat in the firelight and thought about how to present it. She heard the front door. Gideon had been in and out of the house each evening. At roughly the same time, she'd noticed the pattern on the second day and found it reassuring without thinking much about why. He kept ranch hours with an almost mechanical regularity, up at first light, in the yard by 5:30, a long day of work that she glimpsed from the office window in pieces. He rode out twice to check the north grazing land. He spent one full afternoon in the corral with a green horse that was giving the hands trouble, and she'd watched for longer than she intended, observing his patience with the animal, the deliberate and consistent way he worked it, never forcing, never retreating, just steady. Now she heard him come in, heard the measured boot steps in the hallway, and then he appeared in the office doorway. He looked at her face, then at the ledger, then back at her face. "You finished," he said. "I finished." He came in and sat in the chair across from the desk. He looked different in the firelight than he did in daylight. The scar was less visible. Or maybe she'd just stopped noticing it, the way she'd stopped noticing the creak in the office floorboard, something present, and accounted for that no longer required active attention. She turned the final ledger page toward him so he could read the summary she'd written. He read it. His face stayed still. His eyes moved down the page slowly. He reached the underlined number at the bottom. She watched him. 3,000, he said. Conservative. That's what I can fully document. The actual loss may be somewhat higher, but I won't put a number to something I can't prove. He looked up at her. The ranch isn't ruined. No, the damage is real, but recoverable. You have good land, solid livestock valuations, and what looks to me like a genuinely strong herd that's been producing well, despite the theft at the books level. She turned to another page she'd prepared. I've also done a preliminary assessment of your horse operation. You have breeding stock here that, if managed strategically, could become significantly more profitable than your current cattle primary model. But that's a separate conversation. He looked at that page for a moment. Then he set the ledger down. He was quiet. "How do you know about horse breeding?" he said. "My father had a boarding and breeding stable on the outside of Philadelphia for 10 years. I helped with the books from the time I was 12. She paused and I read. I brought 2 texts from Denver. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She could see it in the corners of his mouth, a slight shift that came and went too fast to be called a full expression. "What do you recommend?" he said. "For immediate action, file a complaint with the county sheriff in Cheyenne and present this documentation. The evidence against Hector is substantial enough for a criminal proceeding. You should also send notice to the bank in Cheyenne regarding the suspicious account." She touched the relevant page. "I've written the account details here. And long-term? A new account system. Monthly reconciliation reviews, which I'll conduct. A clear supplier approval process so no invoice gets paid without cross-reference to a delivery record." She turned another page, and a serious look at the horse program. He studied her for a moment. "You've been here 3 days, he said. "I work quickly when I have good material to work with." The fire shifted, a log settling lower, throwing a fresh pulse of warmth and light. The office was comfortable at this hour, close and quiet. The sounds of the ranch outside faded to nothing more than the occasional distant sound from the barn. Gideon leaned back in his chair. He looked at the fire for a moment. "The scar," he said. He wasn't looking at her, just at the fire. "I told you how I got it, but I didn't tell you what came after." She waited. "I was in Cheyenne for 3 months recovering. he said. Couldn't scout. Couldn't work. Spent most of it indoors because going out meant people looking at me like I was something wrong. He paused. Children would cross the street. Women would pull their skirts close. Men would get that look. You know the one, where they can't decide if they're afraid or disgusted, and they pick disgusted because it feels better. She knew the look. A man I'd scouted with for 4 years came to see me once during those months, Gideon continued. Sat down, had coffee, told me I should think about moving somewhere remote, away from settlements, because people weren't going to get used to looking at me, and I'd be better off just removing the problem. He looked at the fire. He thought he was being helpful. People often do, she said. He glanced at her. When they want to avoid discomfort, she said. It's easier to tell the person who makes them uncomfortable to disappear than to examine why they're uncomfortable to begin with. A long pause. Your father's letter, he said. I've been thinking about it. So have I. Do you want to talk about it? She considered the question honestly, which took a moment. Not about him specifically, she said. He made a choice. It hurt. There's not much more to say about it, except that I understand it better than I wish I did. Gideon was quiet. He was ashamed of me, she said. She said it flatly, without theatrical weight, because it was true, and she'd already lived with it long enough that it had gone from a wound to a scar. He had been for years. I was too big, too plain, too opinionated, too everything that a Philadelphia merchant's daughter wasn't supposed to be. When he ran out of money and couldn't think what to do with me, he found a way to make me someone else's problem and get paid for it. A pause. The cruelest thing isn't that he did it. The cruelest thing is that part of me still wishes the story had been different. Gideon looked at her. His expression was careful, attentive. There's no good answer to that, he said. No, there isn't. I know because I spent 2 years wishing my face looked different, he said. 2 years of thinking that if I could just fix that one thing, everything else would resolve. Then one morning I woke up and realized I'd wasted 2 years, and my face still looked the same. He touched the scar briefly, that same unconscious gesture she'd seen before. So I bought this ranch instead. She looked at him. You bought the ranch, she said. Spent everything I had. He said it matter-of-factly. Figured if I was going to be somewhere that made people uncomfortable, I'd at least own the somewhere. She almost laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. He looked at her with a steady, quietly pleased expression. That's the first time you've laughed since you got here, he said. I haven't had much cause, she said. No, he agreed. I suppose you haven't. The fire settled again. The room was warm. Her coffee cup was empty and had been for an hour, but she hadn't wanted to interrupt the work to refill it. Barnaby appeared in the doorway at that moment with the coffee pot, glanced between the two of them with the perfect inscrutability of an experienced ranch hand, refilled her cup without being asked, and vanished back down the hallway. That man knows everything, Gideon said. He's very observant, she agreed. 11 years. He's been here 11 years, and he still sees everything before I do. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Outside, the Wyoming night was deep and cold and full of stars. She'd noticed that on her first night here, looking out the office window at some point past midnight, the stars here were different than in Philadelphia. More of them, or brighter, or both. Back east, you saw the sky through soot and gaslight and the spaces between buildings. Here you saw the whole of it, top to bottom, nothing filtered. I'm going to stay, she said. She said it not as a request or a negotiation, but as a simple statement of fact, a line item in the record. I want you to know that. Whatever the situation was when I arrived, I'm choosing to stay. Gideon looked at her. Nobody's asking you to leave, he said. I know. I'm saying I'm choosing it. She looked at him steadily. That's different. He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, he said. It is. The fire burned low. Neither of them moved to add more wood. The warmth that remained in the room was enough. Clementine turned the ledger toward her and wrote one final line at the bottom of the summary page. Financial review complete. Recovery possible. Evidence secured. Remaining work significant. Assessment: this ranch can be saved. She capped her pen. Gideon was watching the fire, one arm resting on the side of his chair, at ease in his own space in a way that wasn't performed. Just a man sitting by a fire in his own house, with one scar on his face and a ranch that had been stolen from under him for 3.5 years. Sitting across from a woman with a different kind of scar and a ledger full of the proof that things could be different. "The horse program," she said. He looked over. "I want to propose a full breeding strategy," she said, "when you're ready." "Next week," he said. "We'll sit down and you can walk me through it." She nodded. She closed the ledger. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere out across the open land, its voice carrying clean and clear through the cold night. The horses in the near barn answered softly. Then it went quiet again. "Good night, Gideon," she said. "Good night, Miss Vance." She looked at him. "Clementine," she said. He paused, nodded once. "Good night, Clementine." She took her coffee cup and her ledger and went down the hallway to her room. She set the ledger on the bedside table, undressed in the dark, and lay down on the narrow bed. Above her, the ceiling of the room was plain pine, and through the small window, she could see a rectangle of Wyoming sky packed solid with stars. She looked at the stars for a while. She thought about the letter, about her father, about the number at the bottom of the last page, about a man who had bought a ranch with everything he had because he needed somewhere to belong, and a scar that had driven him there. She thought about how understanding doesn't fix things. It just changes how much of your weight you put on them. Then she closed her eyes. She slept better than she had in months. The stallion's name was Copper. Clementine had learned that in her first week at Broken Ridge, during the afternoon she'd spent walking the breeding stables with Barnaby, who'd given her a tour of the horse operation with the same unhurried thoroughness he applied to everything else. Copper was a dark chestnut quarter horse, 4 years old, with a broad chest and strong hindquarters, and a temperament that Barnaby described as particular. What he meant was that Copper trusted very few people and communicated his distrust loudly and immediately to anyone who didn't earn it. "He lets Mr. Thorne handle him," Barnaby had said, leaning on the stall door, "and me on good days. Anyone else, he lets them know they're on his schedule, not theirs." Clementine had studied the horse carefully. His conformation was excellent. Strong through the back, well-angled shoulder, a deep hip that promised power. His bloodline, based on the breeding records she'd found in the files, traced back to a documented quarter horse sire out of Texas with a strong performance record. If managed properly, if bred to mares with complementary traits, Copper could anchor a breeding program that would produce working ranch horses, commanding premium prices from ranchers across the territory. She'd written up the first draft of that program in the evenings over the course of the second week, working by firelight after the ranch settled down, pulling the breeding records and cross-referencing them against the livestock valuations and the market prices she'd found in an old copy of a Colorado stockman's journal that Barnaby had located in the barn. Gideon had read the draft in one sitting, asked 4 precise questions, and told her to move forward. That had been 3 days ago. On the 14th night of her time at Broken Ridge, Clementine woke at 2 in the morning. She wasn't sure what woke her. A sound she hadn't consciously registered, maybe, or simply the particular alertness that comes to people who have spent time being responsible for things they care about. She lay in the dark for a moment, listening. The ranch was quiet. Usual night sounds whined in the pine grove north of the house. A horse shifting in the far corral. The distant call of an owl working the meadow. Then she heard it. Again, a sound from the direction of the southern stables. Not loud. A horse's distress sound low, labored, wrong in its rhythm. She was out of bed and pulling her boots on before she'd fully reasoned through the decision. She took the oil lamp from her bedside table, lit it, and went out through the back door of the house. The night air was cold, sharp with the smell of pine and dry grass. The sky was enormous and black, and scattered with stars. She crossed the yard quickly, the lamp a small orange circle around her feet, and pushed open the south stable door. The smell hit her immediately. She knew that smell. Not well, but she knew it. Sour overlay that comes with colic or poisoning. Different from normal stable smell, thinner and more acrid. She moved down the row of stalls. Copper was in the third stall. He was standing, but his head was low, lower than it should have been, and his weight was shifting restlessly from foot to foot. His coat was dark with sweat along his neck and flanks. As she brought the lamp close, she could see the tension in his muscles, the unnatural stillness of an animal holding itself against pain. "Easy," she said quietly. "Easy, Copper." He turned his head toward her. His eyes were glassy. She opened the stall door carefully and came in, keeping her body language slow and deliberate. She moved to his head, looked at his gums pale, a bad sign, and then looked around the stall. His water bucket was untouched. His hay was barely disturbed. But his grain bucket, the separate feed container that hung on the stall door, was partially emptied. She took the grain bucket off the hook and brought her lamp close. She could smell it before she saw it. A faint chemical overlay on the grain, almost masked, but not quite, with the same sharp undertone she'd caught when she first came in. She looked at the grain carefully in the lamplight. Slight discoloration in places, scattered through, not uniform, adulterated feed. Mixed in, not dumped on top, which meant whoever had done it had taken their time. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. She put the bucket back on the hook, out of Copper's reach, and looked at the horse. He was worth considerable money, more than most people on this ranch made in a year. More importantly, if he died under suspicious circumstances, the breeding program she'd proposed died with him. And with it, Gideon's reputation for managing quality stock. She knew exactly what this was. This was a message. Hector Rust had been gone for almost 2 weeks, but gone didn't mean finished. She went out of the stall and moved quickly to the tack room at the end of the stable, where she found a clean bucket and a length of rope. She filled the bucket from the pump at the stable entrance, clean water, clear, and brought it back to Copper, encouraging him to drink. He resisted at first, then took a few slow pulls. She worked on him for an hour, moving him gently in the stall to discourage the colic from worsening, getting water into him, checking his breathing, watching his gut sounds. She'd done this before, twice, with horses, at her father's stable. She wasn't a veterinarian, but she knew the basic principles, and she applied them steadily, without panic. Panic didn't help horses any more than it helped accounting problems. At some point during that hour, she heard the stable door. She turned. A figure filled the doorway. Not Gideon's silhouette, wrong height, wrong build. Narrower through the shoulder, and the way he was standing had a particular quality of deliberate intrusion. Hector stepped into the lamplight. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago, or maybe it was the hour and the shadows, but his face was harder, the lines in it set deeper. He was wearing a canvas duster, and his hat was pulled low, and he was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for, somewhere between satisfaction and warning. "Found something wrong with the horse?" he said. She kept her voice even. "What are you doing on this property?" "Just passing through." He moved a few steps closer, his boots quiet on the stable floor. "Wanted to check on things. Make sure the new bookkeeper was settling in all right." "You were fired and told to leave," she said. "You're trespassing." Big word for a woman standing alone in a dark barn at 2 in the morning. She looked at him directly. "I found the feed." He smiled. It was a slow smile, and it didn't reach his eyes at all. "Don't know what you're talking about." "I have the bucket. The adulteration is visible under lamplight. A basic analysis at any veterinarian's office will confirm it." She paused. "Combined with the financial documentation I've already assembled, you are building toward a very significant legal problem, Mr. Rust." The smile stayed on his face, but something beneath it shifted. She saw it. "You want to be careful," he said. He said it softly, which was more effective than if he'd said it loudly. "You're new here. You don't know how things work. This isn't Philadelphia. Out here, a woman who makes herself a nuisance has a way of finding that nobody much remembers she was there. I'm quite memorable," she said. "My ledgers particularly." He took another step toward her. She didn't step back. She held the lamp between them and looked at him with the same steady attention she gave to columns of figures that were trying to lie to her. "You don't flinch at a false number. You document it. You need to leave," she said. "I'll leave when I'm ready." He was close now. Too close. She could smell the whiskey on him. Recent and concentrated. Then the stable door opened behind him. Hector turned. Gideon Thorne stood in the doorway. He was in his work pants and boots and an unlaced shirt, clearly having come straight from sleep. But he was fully awake. His eyes moved from Hector to Clementine to Copper's stall to the bucket in her hand, and all of it assembled into comprehension in about 2 seconds. He didn't reach for the pistol at his hip. He didn't need to. He walked through the stable toward Hector with the same deliberate, unhurried stride he used, crossing the yard in daylight, and Hector, who was not a small man, stepped back anyway, not because Gideon was louder or faster or more dramatic, because he was absolutely certain, and certainty in a moving body is more persuasive than almost anything else. He stopped close enough to Hector that Hector had to look up. "You were told to leave this property," Gideon said. "I was just. You poisoned my horse. Still low, still even, and you came back here to threaten my employee." "I didn't, Clementine." He didn't look away from Hector. "Is the horse stable for now?" "Stable, but needs monitoring through the morning," she said. "The feed needs to be sent for analysis. I have the grain bucket secured." "Good." He reached out and gripped Hector's collar. Then, with one clean, sideways motion, he walked him toward the stable door. Hector stumbled, tried to plant his feet, and found that it didn't do much against the forward momentum of 200 pounds of determined movement. Gideon walked him through the stable door, through the yard, and to the north gate, and there he released him with enough force that Hector had to grab the fence post to keep his footing. "If you come back on this land," Gideon said, "I will deliver you to the Cheyenne sheriff personally, and Clementine's documentation will come with you." A pause. "Do you understand me?" Hector straightened himself. He looked at Gideon, then he looked past him toward the stable, where the lamplight was visible through the open door. "You don't know what you've let into your house," Hector said. His voice was controlled now, thin and cold. "Either of them." "I know exactly what I've let in," Gideon said. "A bookkeeper who caught 3 years of your theft in 3 days, and a horse worth more than every dollar you ever took." He stepped back from the gate. "Go." Hector held his gaze for another moment. Then he turned up his collar against the night cold and walked away up the approach road, his boots fading into the dark. Gideon stood at the gate and watched until he was gone. Then he came back to the stable. Clementine was inside with Copper, the grain bucket sitting on the tack room shelf, her lamp still burning. She was checking the horse's gum color again when Gideon came through the door. "Better," she said, without turning. "His color is coming back slightly. I'd like to stay with him until dawn." "I'll stay with you," he said. She looked back at him. He was leaning against the stall door, arms crossed, watching the horse. He hadn't said it as an offer, exactly. More as a statement of what was going to happen, which she was coming to recognize as simply how he spoke. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." He looked at her. "But here we both are." She turned back to Copper. The horse was quieter now, his head slightly higher, the restless weight shifting less frequent. She ran a hand down his neck and felt him exhale slowly, a long, loosening breath. "You've handled a sick horse before," Gideon said. "A few times. My father's stable. You knew what you were looking for. I knew what the smell meant, and I knew the signs in the gums." She paused. "I was afraid I'd be too late." Gideon was quiet for a moment. You weren't. Outside, the Wyoming night went on in its enormous, indifferent way. Stars moved slowly overhead. The temperature dropped another degree. Inside the stable, the warm smell of horses and hay was a kind of shelter, and the lamp burned steadily between them, and Copper breathed better with each passing quarter hour. Gideon sat on the tacked trunk at the end of the aisle. Clementine sat on an upturned bucket near the stall door. They didn't talk much. That was all right. There is a kind of company that doesn't require words to be real, and both of them had been alone enough to know the difference. At some point, close to 4 in the morning, Barnaby arrived. He came through the door with a second lamp and a blanket under each arm, handed one to each of them without commentary, and settled himself against the opposite wall on a hay bale. Figured something was going on, he said, when I heard the gate. You heard the gate? Clementine said. I hear most things, he said. He looked at Copper. Horse doing better? Yes, she said. Good. He pulled his own blanket around his shoulders and leaned his head back against the wall. Wake me if you need me. Within 5 minutes, he appeared to be asleep. Gideon looked at him, then at Clementine, and the corner of his mouth moved. She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. It wasn't the moment for smiling, but it was close. By dawn, Copper was standing with his head up, interested in the world again, demanding his proper hay with the entitled authority of a horse who had recovered his opinion of himself. Clementine checked him once more, confirmed his vital signs were returning to normal, and stood up from the stall floor, with her back aching and her eyes scratchy from the long night. Barnaby was already gone. He'd slipped out somewhere around 5 without a sound. Gideon was standing at the stable entrance, looking out at the dawn coming up over the eastern grazing land, a thin line of gold at the edge of the world. Spreading slowly, the sky above it going from black to deep blue to a pale and luminous gray. She came to stand beside him. He'll come back, she said. Hector. Not to the ranch necessarily, but he won't let this go. I know. Gideon looked at the horizon. He never has been a man who lets things go. We need to file with the sheriff sooner rather than later. Tomorrow morning, he said. I'll ride to Cheyenne. I'll have the full documentation package ready today. He looked at her. She was still holding the blanket Barnaby had brought her. The lamp burned down to almost nothing in her other hand, her dark hair loose from the braid she'd put it in before bed, wearing a dress she'd thrown on in a hurry, with only half the buttons done at the back. She looked like a woman who had been up all night saving a horse, which was exactly what she was. He looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention. You could have woken me when you first heard Copper, he said. I assessed the situation first, she said. If I had been wrong about what it was, I didn't want to alarm the house over a routine colic. And if Hector had come while you were alone, he did come while I was alone, for a few minutes. A few minutes was enough to establish that I wasn't going to be frightened off. She looked at him. I needed him to know that. Gideon held her gaze. Something moved in his expression that she'd started to recognize over the past 2 weeks, a quiet, considered acknowledgement, the look of a man who has revised his assessment of something and doesn't feel the need to make a performance of it. All right, he said. She nodded. They stood together at the stable door and watched the dawn come up over Broken Ridge Ranch, gold spreading across the wide Wyoming land, touching the pine grove and the corrals and the roof of the main house, making everything briefly and completely beautiful. Hector Rust was gone, for now. But Clementine was already thinking about documentation. She was already composing the letter for the Cheyenne sheriff in her head, organizing the evidence package, deciding which figures to lead with. She was already 3 steps ahead, which was, as it happened, where she worked best. The sun cleared the horizon. She went inside to get her pen. October came to Wyoming like a painter, who'd been saving the best colors for last. The hills to the north went from summer green to a deep, burning gold almost overnight, the aspens turning first and brightest, their leaves catching the light and throwing it back in every direction. The pine stands stayed dark green, but the scrub oak around them went rust and amber, and the whole country looked, on the best mornings, like something someone had made up to describe beauty and then accidentally built for real. The temperature dropped. Not to winter yet, but to the sharp, honest cold of an early mountain autumn, the kind that made your breath visible in the mornings and made the sky look cleaned. The ranch settled into a different rhythm. The long cattle drives of summer were done. The hands were moving to shorter range work, checking fence lines, preparing the hay stores for winter, rotating livestock to pastures that would hold better through the cold months. Clementine had moved out of the office. Not entirely, the account books were still there, and always would be, and she still spent her mornings at the desk, but her afternoons had begun to extend outward. First to the breeding stables, where the program she'd designed was now actively underway, with 2 of the mares from the eastern pasture brought in to be assessed for breeding readiness. Then to the corrals, where she'd started spending time with the horses in a way that had begun as professional interest and become something more personal. Barnaby had noticed. Of course, Barnaby had noticed. "You like horses," he'd said one afternoon, appearing at her elbow with the particular silent materialism she'd given up trying to predict. "I always have," she said. "Copper likes you back," he said. "For what it's worth." It was worth something, actually. Copper was selective, and his selectiveness was not random. He liked people who were consistent and honest and not performing anything, which, Clementine thought, was a more reliable measure of character than most methods available to human beings. She'd been riding for 3 weeks now. Gideon had suggested it after the second week, when she'd spent 2 full afternoons in the corral with a quiet bay mare named Agnes, who seemed to enjoy company. He'd said it simply, without preamble. "Agnes needs exercise, and you look like you need some air." Makes sense. Then he'd gotten her a saddle from the tack room and helped her get up on the mare, and that had been that. Except the saddle was wrong. She hadn't said anything. The saddle from the tack room was a standard ranch saddle, built for the average working cowhand, and it didn't fit her. It dug into her thighs on one side and sat wrong across her hips. And after an hour of riding, she came back with her jaw set in the way it got when she was managing discomfort without complaining. Gideon had watched her dismount and watched the way she moved afterward and said nothing that day. But 2 mornings later, a wagon had arrived from Cheyenne. She'd been in the office when Barnaby knocked. "Mr. Thorne's asking for you in the yard," he said. She came out to find Gideon standing beside the wagon with a saddle across his arms. It was a beautiful thing. Wide-seated, built from dark-oiled leather, with a broad stable skirt and a deep, comfortable seat that was clearly designed for a different proportion than the standard saddle in the tack room. The stirrup leathers were set wider. The cantle was built up slightly at the back for stability. Even the horn was positioned differently, set for a rider who needed different balance points. He held it out to her. "Had it made in Cheyenne," he said. "Told the saddle maker your general measurements." He adjusted from there. He paused. "If it needs further modification, he can do it." She looked at the saddle, then at him. "You had this made for me," she said. "You needed a proper saddle." He said it the way he said most things plainly, without making an event of it, as though having something custom-made for a person was simply a logical response to a practical problem. "Try it this afternoon. Tell me if it's wrong." She took it from him. It was heavy and warm from the sun, and it smelled of new leather and the linseed oil the saddler had used on it. She turned it in her hands and looked at the craftsmanship. The stitching was tight and even, the leather worked smooth, the rigging solid. "Thank you," she said. "It's a working saddle," he said, "not a gift. You ride for the ranch now, same as anyone." She looked at him. He was looking at the saddle in her hands rather than at her, and she understood this was his way of giving her room to receive it, without making her feel observed. She appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. "I'll try it this afternoon," she said. She did. Agnes moved differently under her with the right saddle. Or rather, Clementine moved differently on Agnes settled, balanced, her weight properly distributed, instead of fighting the tack the whole way. She rode out the south gate and up into the low hills above the ranch, following the trail that Barnaby had shown her the previous week, the one that wound up through the scrub oak and opened eventually onto a long ridge with a view of the whole valley below. She rode for an hour alone before she heard the second horse behind her. She glanced back. Gideon was coming up the trail on his dark horse, moving at an easy gallop. Not rushing to catch up, he seemed content to come at his own pace, which he did. He pulled up alongside her as the trail widened near the top of the ridge. They rode side by side in silence for a while. The ridge opened up ahead of them, the scrub oak falling back and the ground leveling, and the whole of the Wyoming country spread out below and around them in the October light. The valley floor was gold and amber, the far hills purple in the distance, the creek that ran through the eastern edge of the ranch, catching the light and flashing silver between the cottonwoods. The sky was that particular deep October blue that looked like it went up forever. Gideon pulled his horse to a stop, and she stopped beside him. They sat on the ridge and looked at it. "How's the saddle?" he said. "Perfect. Good." Wind moved across the ridge, easy and cool, carrying the smell of pine from the higher ground behind them. He looked out at the valley for a moment. Then he looked at her. She was watching the view with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the focused, pen-ready attention she wore when she was working. This was something quieter, unguarded. She was sitting straight in the new saddle, her hands loose on the reins, and she looked, for the first time since he'd known her, as though she wasn't carrying anything. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked at him. "You can. What was it like? In Philadelphia? Before you came here?" She was quiet for a moment. "Narrow," she said. Everything was narrow. The streets, the rooms, the opinions. She looked back at the valley. "I was always too much of something for the space they'd set aside for me. Too big physically, too interested in the wrong things. Too." She paused. "There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending years making yourself smaller than you are, pulling your shoulders in, taking up less chair, keeping your voice down when you know you're right." She turned her hands over on the reins. "I did it for a long time because I thought that if I could just get small enough, people would stop noticing what they didn't like about me." "Did it work?" "No." She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. It never works. You just end up small and invisible, and they still don't like you. He was looking at her. "The world back east," he said, "forced you to shrink yourself to fit into their narrow little boxes." He said it slowly, like he was putting words to something he'd been thinking for a while. "At Broken Ridge, I want you to take up space." He held her gaze. "You don't need to change a single thing." She looked at him. The wind moved her hair where it had come loose from her bonnet. The light was changing as the afternoon deepened, going from clear gold to a warmer amber, the particular quality of light in the last hour before sunset that makes everything look more itself, more real, more at rest. She hadn't expected those words. She'd expected nothing, or something practical, the way Gideon usually delivered himself. But those words landed somewhere genuine, somewhere she hadn't let most things reach in a long time. "People don't usually say that," she said. "People are usually wrong about what matters," he said. "I've had time to form an opinion on that." She looked at him for a moment more. His face in this light, the scar, the strong jaw, the dark eyes that were watching her with complete steadiness, was a face she'd stopped reading as anything other than what it was, which was honest. Which was, she'd come to understand, the thing she trusted most about him. He was genuine. In a world that had spent most of her life performing convenience at her expense, genuine was the most important quality a person could have. She looked back at the valley. "I can breathe out here," she said. It was a simple thing to say, and she meant it completely. "That's Wyoming," he said. It's also this ranch. She paused. It's also you. He was quiet. The sun was moving toward the western ridge now, dropping in that last rapid way it does in autumn, and the light was going golden orange across the whole valley below them, touching the tops of the cottonwoods by the creek and making them glow, touching the roof of the main house far below, touching the horses in the distant corrals. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. There was a moment, one of those moments, that has a quality of decision in it, even though nothing is decided out loud. The air between them was still except for the small wind across the ridge. Agnes moved her head slightly and settled. The dark horse flicked an ear. Gideon reached out slowly, no performance of it, and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn. His hand was large and calloused from years of work, warm despite the cool air, and when he wrapped it around her fingers, she felt the steadiness that was simply his nature, the same steadiness he brought to everything. She didn't pull away. She looked at him. He leaned across the space between the horses and kissed her. It was careful and unhurried and entirely honest, which was how he did most things. Not theatrical, not a proclamation. Just the true thing, offered plainly. She felt the scratch of his face against hers, and the warmth of him against the autumn cold, and the utter solidity of his presence, and something that had been held tight for years, not just weeks, not just since Philadelphia, but for years before that, since the first time a room full of people had looked at her, and decided before she'd spoken what she was worth something, in all that old tension released. Not all of it. These things don't release all at once. But enough, she kissed him back. When they drew apart, the sun had slipped another notch toward the ridge, and the valley below them was full of that particular amber evening light that exists for maybe 20 minutes and then is gone. And in those 20 minutes, everything in it is perfect in a way that is better for being brief. Agnes shifted beneath her. Clementine sat up straighter in the new saddle, which fit her exactly right and held her exactly right. And she looked at Gideon. He looked back. His dark eyes were quiet and steady and genuinely warm, which was a combination she had not encountered often enough. "We should head back," she said. "The mares need evening check." "They do," he said. He didn't release her hand immediately, held it a moment longer, then let go, and turned his horse and started back down the trail toward Broken Ridge. She followed. Below them, the ranch was coming alive with the small lights of evening, the bunkhouse windows, the barn lantern, the lamp Barnaby had lit in the front room of the main house. Smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney. Someone was working the corral, a dark shape moving against the fence in the fading light. It looked, she thought, like a place where someone could belong, not despite everything, but genuinely, fully, on her own terms. She rode down the hill in the October light with her back straight and her hands easy on the reins, and the saddle fit her perfectly, and the view was magnificent. And for the first time, in longer than she could precisely remember, she was not making herself smaller. She was taking up exactly the right amount of space. And it was enough. It was more than enough. That evening, after the mares had been checked, and the stables secured, and the hands drifted to the bunkhouse, Clementine sat in the office and opened her ledger to a page she kept at the very back, separate from the financial records and the documentation files. A personal page, she wrote in it, rarely. She picked up her pen, October 11, 1888. Rode the ridge above the South Valley today. Proper saddle. Good horse. Good company. She paused. Then she wrote, "The breeding program is ahead of schedule. The financial recovery is on track. The documentation for Hector Rust's case is with the Cheyenne sheriff and proceeding." Another pause. "This place is becoming something I didn't expect. I am becoming something I didn't expect. I think these two facts are related." She looked at what she'd written. Then she added one more line. "I am not small here." She capped her pen. Outside, the October night came down over Wyoming, cold and clear and full of stars, and Broken Ridge Ranch settled into the dark And in the morning, there would be work to do. There was always work to do. She found lately that she looked forward to it. The first snow came on a Tuesday. It arrived the way early winter always does in Wyoming, without much warning, and with complete commitment. One morning, the sky was the usual pale November blue, and by noon it had gone flat and gray and low, the clouds pressing down over the mountains to the north, like a hand pushing a lid onto a pot. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. The hands came in from the fence work early, reading the sky the way men do when they've spent enough seasons in open country to trust what the sky tells them. Barnaby stood in the yard at 2 in the afternoon, looked north for about 30 seconds, and said to nobody in particular, "This one's going to be serious." He was right. By 4 o'clock, snow was moving horizontally across the yard. Clementine had spent the afternoon in the office, working through the final correspondence she needed to prepare for the upcoming Cheyenne auction, a formal presentation of Broken Ridge's horse breeding program to a committee of government supply officers who were looking to contract a reliable source of working horses for the territorial army posts. The meeting was in 10 days. The paperwork needed to be exact, which meant she'd been at the desk since morning with barely a break, and she hadn't noticed how fast the light failed until she looked up and found the office window showing nothing but gray-white. She went to the window. The yard was a wall of moving snow. She could barely make out the barn. She started gathering the papers into their folder when she heard shouting from the direction of the hay barn. Not the ordinary raising of voices over wind. This was alarm. She was out the back door and into the yard before she'd finished thinking it through, pulling her coat on as she went. The snow hit her face immediately, cold and stinging, the wind behind it, strong enough to lean into. She crossed the yard with her head down, following the sound of voices. The hay barn was on the south edge of the ranch, separate from the main stables, a large structure that held the winter hay stores. She could smell it before she could see it clearly, a smell that cut through the cold and the snow and hit her in the face like a wall. Smoke. She came around the corner of the fence and stopped. The south end of the hay barn was on fire. In the snow and the wind, it was a surreal image, orange light and black smoke against the white-gray of the blizzard. Fire moving fast through dry hay, despite the moisture in the air, the wind feeding it rather than suppressing it. 3 of the hands were running between the water trough and the barn with buckets, and from the look of it, they'd been at it for several minutes already, and the fire was winning. Gideon was there. She could see him at the barn entrance, directing the hands, his voice carrying through the wind. And then she saw the horses. Someone had opened the south corral. Whether it was the fire or the chaos or deliberate action, she couldn't tell, but the gate was open, and the cattle in the adjacent pen were pushing through it, moving in the blind panic that large animals fall into when fire is near, scattering into the blizzard. She moved toward Gideon. "The cattle are out," she shouted. He turned and saw her. His face was tight, reading the situation in all directions at once. "I know. Barnaby's trying to get ahead of them." He looked back at the barn. "We can't save the hay. Get back to the house. I can help with Clementine." His voice had a different quality in it now, not the everyday authority of a ranch boss, but something sharper, directed specifically at her. "Get to the house. I need to know you're safe." She hesitated. Then she heard the horses, not from the barn, from the north side of the yard, hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming in fast from the approach road. She turned. Through the snow, dark shapes resolving into riders 3, 4 of them moving at a gallop into the ranch yard. She didn't recognize any of them. Gideon saw them the same moment she did. She saw his hand move to his side. The riders came into the yard and pulled up, their horses throwing snow. They weren't ranch hands. They weren't dressed for honest work in a blizzard. They spread out in a practiced way, a deliberate positioning, and in the firelight from the burning barn, she could see their faces, hardened faces, purposeful, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Rustlers, bordermen, the kind hired for specific jobs, and at the back of the group, just coming through the gate on a gray horse, sat Hector Rust. He looked different than he had in the stable that night 2 months ago, more settled into whatever he'd decided to do. He had the look of a man who had been planning something and was now past the point of turning back, which made him more dangerous than he'd been before, not less. Gideon stepped forward. One of the riders moved his horse sideways to cut him off. Gideon stopped. Hector. His voice was flat. Evening, Thorne. Hector pulled his horse up close. The fire was behind him now, throwing orange light across everything. Looking like you've got a bad night ahead. You set that fire. Blizzards are dangerous. Things burn. Hector looked around the yard, at the panicked cattle, pushing through the broken gate, at the hands still working the burning barn. Hard to keep track of a ranch in weather like this. Two of the hands had noticed the riders and stopped their bucket work. They were watching, uncertain, looking toward Gideon. Spread out, one of the riders said quietly to the others. Move the herd. They broke off, spurring their horses toward the scattered cattle, driving them further from the yard, further into the blizzard, not rounding them up, scattering them further. Gideon moved forward again. The crack of a gunshot split the air. It came from one of the riders, a warning shot, she thought, until she saw Gideon stagger. He didn't go down. He caught himself, one hand going to his right side, under his ribs. He straightened up. In the firelight, she could see the change in his face, the jaw tightening, the eyes going sharp with the particular focus of a man overriding pain with will. Gideon! She was moving toward him. Hector's horse cut between them. Not Hector, the rider to his left, moving fast. And suddenly there was a hand on her arm, gripping, pulling. She twisted hard and got a hand free and drove her elbow back, connecting. But there were two of them, and they were bigger, and she was pulled off her feet. And then she was beside Hector's horse, with her arm wrenched up behind her, and Hector looking down at her from the saddle. You've been a problem since you got here, he said. Let go of me. Her voice came out even. She was looking at Gideon. Gideon was on his feet. His hand was pressed to his side. Dark wet spreading under his fingers, visible in the firelight. He was looking at her. His expression was the most frightened she'd ever seen him, and it wasn't because of the bullet. Easy, Thorne, Hector said. She gets on the wagon, and we leave. Simple. If you take her wagon, Hector said to the man holding her. She was moved, not gently, toward a wagon that had come in behind the riders and stopped near the gate. A canvas-topped ranch wagon, a driver on the bench she didn't recognize, two horses already restless in the snow and noise. She looked back at Gideon. He took a step toward her. The rider who'd shot him moved his horse between them. Get the wagon moving, Hector said. She was pushed up onto the bench. The man holding her climbed up on her other side. Hector rode alongside. The wagon started. She looked back through the blizzard. Gideon was standing in the middle of the yard. Both hands were at his side now, one pressed to the wound, and he was watching the wagon, and the snow was coming down between them, thickening and thickening, and the fire from the burning barn threw orange light across the yard, and black smoke up into the gray-white sky, and the hands were running, and the cattle were gone into the dark, and Barnaby was somewhere in the blizzard, shouting for the herd, and the distance between them grew. Gideon took another step forward. His boot caught in a rut, and he went down to one knee. He put his hand out to the ground and pushed himself back up. The snow under his hand came up red. She watched him straighten, watched him try to walk forward, watched his leg give. He went down again, this time fully, his shoulder hitting the snow, his body rolling to his side. One arm reached forward toward where the wagon had been. His hand pressed flat against the snow. The blizzard came down between them. The yard and the fire, and Gideon on the ground, vanished into white. The wagon moved north into the storm. The wagon moved fast for the first mile. The driver knew the road well enough to hold the pace despite the blizzard, and the horses were fresh and motivated by the cold and the noise behind them. Clementine sat on the bench with the man on her right side, gripping her arm at the elbow, not painfully but firmly, and Hector riding alongside the wagon on the left, visible through the blowing snow in irregular glimpses. She didn't struggle. Not yet. She was counting things. The minutes. The direction of travel north-northwest by the feel of the wind, which had been coming from the southwest all day, meaning it was now hitting her left cheek. The sound of the horses, their breathing, their pace, the canvas roof of the wagon behind her, its frame poles, the lashing that held it to the sideboard. The man on her right, he was large, broader than her, but he was also cold and annoyed, and paying more attention to the weather than to her hands. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was thinking about Gideon on the snow. She filed that image in the place. She put things she could not afford to fall into right now. Deliberately, consciously set it aside. The way you set a ledger entry aside when you need to finish the column before you can fix the error. She would come back to it. She would come back to it as soon as she had done what needed doing. The wagon slowed slightly as the road climbed. She'd looked at the maps of the region around Broken Ridge, enough to know the land. North-northwest from the ranch, past the first ridge, the road dipped into a stone canyon, a narrow cut between rock walls that carried the winter road toward the next valley. The canyon walls would block the wind. The road surface in there would be slicker, the rock holding the cold differently than open ground. The driver would have to slow down. She looked at the man on her right. He'd shifted his grip from her elbow to a looser position on her forearm, his attention half on Hector through the snow, tracking for instructions. His rifle was slung across his back, both hands occupied with holding her and holding the bench against the lurching wagon. The revolver at his hip was on his right side, away from her. She looked at the road ahead. The canyon entrance was visible, two dark rock walls rising from the white ground, narrowing the road to maybe 12 feet. The driver checked the horses slightly. The pace dropped. She drew a slow breath. Then she moved. She dropped her weight to the left, away from the man's grip, and simultaneously drove her right elbow hard into his ribs. He had a second of surprised incomprehension. People underestimate weight as force, which is a mathematical error she'd corrected in her own thinking a long time ago. And that second was enough. She grabbed the left rail of the bench with both hands and pulled herself fully that direction, putting her whole body into it, and he slid right on the bench and grabbed for the railing on his side to keep from going off the edge. The driver half-turned. She grabbed the reins. He tried to take them back, and she pulled hard left, a decisive yank, putting everything she had into it. The horses lurched left. The wagon, moving at reduced speed on the icy canyon road, answered the turn, the left wheels lifting, the whole frame tilting. The driver swore. She yanked again. The wagon went over. It went slowly enough not to be violent about it, but completely the left wheels riding up off the road surface, the frame tilting past the point of recovery, and then the whole thing rolling into the right side snowbank with a crash of wood and canvas and the surprised shouts of 3 men. The horses, still hitched but freed from the weight of the wagon, scrambled forward on the road and stopped, breathing hard. She hit the snowbank shoulder first and sank into it to the elbow. Cold, cold beyond describing, like being plunged into something that immediately wanted to take everything from her. She pushed herself up. The man who'd been holding her was tangled in the canvas. The driver was on his feet but had gone the wrong direction, toward the horses. Hector was still on his horse, which had shied at the crash and was sideways across the canyon road, Hector fighting it back under control. She got up and ran, not away from the ranch, toward it. She went south along the canyon road, back the way they'd come, running with her head down and her arms moving, finding her footing on the frozen ground. Behind her she heard Hector's voice, sharp and furious, and then the sound of his horse following, But the canyon was narrow, and the fallen wagon was blocking most of it. And by the time he'd gotten around it, she was out of the canyon entrance and into open ground, and the blizzard swallowed her whole. She ran until she couldn't hear the horse anymore. Then she stopped and put her hands on her knees and breathed. The wind hit her full from the southwest now, driving the snow into her left side. She was in open ground. No landmarks visible. The blizzard a complete white in every direction. She had no lamp. No coat she'd had it when she crossed the ranch yard, but it was in the wagon or the snowbank now. Her dress was already wet through on the left side from the fall. Her hands were bare. She stood up straight and thought. She knew the direction of the wind. She knew the ranch was to the south-southeast from the canyon, roughly a mile and a half across open ground. She knew the approximate grade of the land. The ranch was in a shallow valley, which meant she should be going slightly downhill. She knew the road was behind her, and she couldn't use it because Hector could use it too. She picked a line and started walking, not running. Running burned energy she would need, and running in a blizzard without visibility meant falling, and falling in wet clothes in this temperature was a path she didn't intend to take. She walked at a steady pace, head down, arms crossed over her chest, going south-southeast by the feel of the wind on her right cheek. The cold was extraordinary, real, serious cold, the kind that starts as sensation and progresses through pain and toward a numbness she knew was dangerous. She moved her fingers constantly, flexing them, keeping the blood moving. She counted her steps in groups of 50. When she reached 50, she counted another 50. This was not hopeful thinking. This was arithmetic. Arithmetic kept her in the present, kept her feet moving, kept the distance between her and the ranch, a number she was steadily reducing rather than an impossible expanse. At around 300 steps, she found the blood. She almost missed it. The snow was trampled and churned here, the signs of the chaos from an hour ago just barely visible under the fresh cover. But there a dark stain, almost black against the white, already being covered, but still there. She stopped. She knelt and looked at it. Her heart was doing something in her chest that was loud and fast, but her hands were steady as she touched the edge of the stain. She looked up from it and searched the ground around her, reading it the way she'd learned to read a page of numbers, looking for pattern, for direction, for what the evidence was telling her. There, another mark, 3 feet ahead, and another, a trail, broken, irregular, the marks of a man who was not walking steadily but was still moving. Going south, she stood up and followed it. She followed it for what she estimated was another quarter-mile, the marks becoming harder to find as the snow filled them faster, having to stop in circles sometimes to pick up the trace again. The cold was inside her coat, now inside her skin. It felt like she was shaking steadily. She pressed her arms tighter to her chest and kept going. Then she saw him. He was against a low boulder, half sitting, half slumped, one shoulder against the rock. The dark horse was gone, had probably bolted in the chaos. His hat was gone too. He was in his shirt and vest, no coat, and the snow had settled on him in a thin layer on the shoulders and hat brim and the planes of his face. Too still, she crossed the distance between them at a run and dropped to her knees beside him. Gideon. No response. She put her hands on his face. Cold, deep, serious cold. She pressed her fingers to his neck, a pulse, present, but slow and irregular. His lips had a grayish quality that frightened her. She pulled his coat. He had a coat, she realized. It had fallen half off him. She pushed it back onto his shoulders and looked at his side. The wound was on the right, below the ribs, and it had bled considerably. The fabric around it was frozen stiff with blood. She pressed her hand against it firmly, and he made a sound. Not words, but a sound which meant he was alive enough to feel pain, which was the most useful information she'd had in the last hour. "I've got you," she said. "I've got you, Gideon." She needed to move him. She looked around. The boulder he was against was the largest thing visible in the white, but 20 feet to the east, she could make out a darker shape, a rock formation. a shelf of stone jutting from the hillside that she'd ridden past on one of her morning rides and recognized now by its outline. There was a shallow space under that shelf. Not a proper cave, but protected from the wind and the direct snow, 3 walls of stone, deep enough for 2 people. She could get him there. She positioned herself, put her arms under his, and pulled. He was heavy. She had known he would be, and she prepared for it, distributing her weight and using her legs rather than her back, bracing her boots against the frozen ground. He came forward an inch, then another. She moved backward toward the rock shelf, one slow step at a time, hauling him with her teeth set and her breathing coming hard and visible in the cold air. It took 10 minutes to move him 20 feet. She got him under the rock shelf and positioned him against the back wall, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides. The temperature in the narrow space was immediately better, still desperately cold, but without the wind it was survivable. In a way the open ground hadn't been. She sat beside him and put her arms around him. Not delicately, not performing tenderness. She pulled him close because their combined body heat was now the only heat available. And body heat is a practical and mathematical resource, and she was going to use every unit of it she had. He stirred slightly, his head turned toward her. "Clementine." His voice was barely a sound. "I'm here." She pulled his coat tighter around them both. "I'm right here." "The ranch Barnaby will manage the ranch," she said. "He's been managing it in various forms for 11 years. Stop talking. You came back." "Of course I came back." Her voice stayed even. "You were bleeding in the snow. Did you expect me to leave you?" A silence. Then, barely, "No." "Then stop being surprised." She pulled him closer. She needed fire. She looked around the rock shelter. The floor was stone and frozen earth. No obvious dry wood visible in the immediate vicinity, but she'd seen scrub growth on the uphill side of the rock formation when she'd come in from the east. She needed to find it, break off whatever dead branches she could, and get a fire going at the entrance of the shelter to reflect heat back in. She would have to leave him for a few minutes to do it. "I'm going to get firewood," she said. "I'll be back in 5 minutes. Stay awake." "I'm awake." He didn't sound fully awake. She pressed her hand against his side. The bleeding had slowed, which was partly reassuring and partly just a sign of how much he'd already lost. She needed the fire more for warmth than light. Hypothermia in a wounded man was a faster killer than the wound itself. She knew this because she'd read about it in a medical text she'd borrowed from a doctor's waiting room in Philadelphia 2 years ago while waiting to present an audit, the way she read everything she could get her hands on, storing information that might someday be useful. She was grateful for that now, in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She went out into the blizzard. The wind hit her immediately, and the cold came back full force without his body beside her. She moved fast along the rock formation, found the scrub growth on the uphill side, low juniper and dry sage, some of the inner branches protected enough from the snow to be workable. She broke off everything she could carry. 2 armloads. She found a third-sized juniper that had died against the rock and broke the lower branches completely free, the dry wood cracking sharp and clean. She came back to the shelter. She arranged the wood at the entrance, small material. First, the dry sage broken fine, the juniper layered over it. She needed fire. She searched her dress pockets with freezing fingers and found the small matchbook she kept in her left dress pocket, because she lit the office lamps herself every evening, and she was always practical about what she carried on her person. 11 matches. The first 2 failed. Wind found its way into the shelter even at the entrance. She turned her body to block it, curled herself around the stack of wood, and struck the 3rd match. It caught. The sage took it. She fed it carefully, one small piece at a time, the way you build something fragile and important with attention, with patience, without rushing it. The juniper caught after 2 minutes. The fire was small but real, and she positioned it at the exact front edge of the shelter where the stone walls would reflect the heat back in. She went back to Gideon. His eyes were open. Watching the fire, she settled beside him again, her back against the stone wall, and pulled him close, and his head came down against her shoulder, with the unguarded heaviness of a man who was running out of energy to hold himself upright. "Your hands are frozen," he said. "They'll be fine, Clementine." "They'll be fine," she said again firmly. "The fire is going. You need to stay warm and stay awake and let your body do the work. That's all." A silence. "The wagon," he said. "Did you?" "I flipped it into a snowbank," she said. "Then I walked back." He was quiet for a moment. "You flipped it." The road surface in the canyon was icy. The turn radius was sufficient. She paused. "Basic physics." Another silence. "Basic physics," he repeated. She looked at him. In the firelight, his color was slowly improving. Still too pale, still frightening, but not the gray-white of 20 minutes ago. He was shivering now, which was actually a good sign. "You stop shivering when you stop fighting. You're going to be all right," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you do, and that's close enough." She held him and tended the fire through the night. She fed it in small, careful increments, keeping it exactly large enough to throw heat without burning through the wood too fast. She kept her hand pressed to Gideon's side to monitor the wound and got him to drink from the small amount of snow she melted in her cupped hands near the flame. She watched his color and his breathing and his pulse, and when he drifted, she said his name, and he answered, and when he asked questions, she answered them to keep him focused. He asked her about the horse program at one point, somewhere around midnight, by her estimate. She told him about it in full detail. Every aspect of the breeding plan, the market projections, the government contract proposal that was sitting on the office desk, waiting for the Cheyenne meeting. She gave him numbers, real numbers, accurate ones, because she knew he could follow them, and because concentrating on numbers kept both of them from disappearing into the cold and the fear. He listened. He asked a question about the projected foal prices. She answered it. He asked another. She answered that one too. Somewhere after 2 in the morning, his shivering lessened and his breathing deepened, and he slept. Real sleep. She checked his pulse steadier. She checked the wound, no fresh bleeding. She looked at his face in the firelight. The scar that had once been the first thing people saw when they looked at him was just his face now, just Gideon's face. She hadn't noticed it as a separate feature in weeks. She added wood to the fire. Outside, the blizzard was easing. She could hear it in the change of the wind, the way the gusts were becoming less consistent. The silence between them longer. The snow was still falling, but not horizontally anymore. The worst of it had passed. She sat with him through what remained of the night. At first, light, gray and cold and clear, she heard them. Horses, multiple horses, moving fast from the south. She got up and went to the entrance of the shelter and looked out. Barnaby was in the lead. He was on his big roan coming across the snow at a careful gallop, reading the ground ahead of him. Behind him were 2 of the hands, and one of them was leading Gideon's dark horse, found and recaptured. She stepped out from under the rock shelf and raised her arm. Barnaby saw her immediately. He pulled up 20 yards away and swung down from his horse with a speed that belied his age. He covered the ground between them quickly, his eyes moving from her to the shelter, behind her and back, reading everything fast the way he always did. "He's in there," she said. "Bullet wound, right side below the ribs. He lost significant blood. He's sleeping, but stable." Barnaby looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. "You kept him alive," he said. "It was a practical problem," she said. Barnaby looked at her with those deep-set eyes. "No," he said. "It was love." She looked at him. He was already moving past her, toward the shelter. She turned and looked out at the snow-covered Wyoming land, the dawn light coming up gray and pale gold over the eastern hills. The blizzard gone, the world left clean and white and quiet. The tracks she'd made coming in were still faintly visible, her footprints leading south through the snow. One set of tracks coming in, two people going out. The hands arrived beside her, bringing blankets and rope, and the practical expertise of men who knew how to move an injured person through cold country. She helped them position Gideon on the improvised carry, gave them the details of the wound and the night, answered their questions clearly and completely. Then she helped them carry him home. 3 days later, Gideon sat up in the bed in the main house bedroom and demanded to see the documentation for the government contract. Clementine brought it to him. He read it with a bandage wrapped tight around his ribs and a cup of coffee going cold on the nightstand. And when he'd finished, he looked up at her and said, "This is ready. It's been ready for a week," she said. "I was waiting on the weather. The auction is in 4 days, I know." He looked at her. She was sitting in the chair beside his bed, with her own ledger open in her lap, where she'd been working while he read. She looked, he thought, like a woman who had walked back through a blizzard and spent a night keeping a man alive, and then gone straight back to work, which was exactly what she was. "Clementine," he said. She looked up. He didn't have words that were big enough for what he wanted to say. He'd never been a man who had those kinds of words. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You would have done the same," she said. "I would have," he agreed. She nodded and looked back down at her ledger. Outside, Broken Ridge Ranch was putting itself back together. The burned hay barn was a loss, but the livestock had been recovered, most of them, all but 4 head that Barnaby was still tracking. The rustlers were gone. Hector was gone. The sheriff in Cheyenne had been notified, and deputies were looking. And in 4 days, there was an auction to attend. She had work to do. She picked up her pen. The morning of the Cheyenne auction, Clementine was up at 4. She didn't need the hour for vanity. She needed it for preparation. She spread her documentation across the office desk in the order she intended to present it, the 3-year audit summary first, then the fraud evidence organized by category, then the breeding program projections, and finally, the government contract proposal with the supporting livestock valuations. Each section was separated by a folded paper marker she'd labeled in clear block letters. Each page was numbered. Each figure was cross-referenced to at least one supporting document. She had done this kind of work before, presented audits to rooms full of men who hadn't wanted to hear what she had to say. She knew the particular challenge of walking into a space where people had already decided you were less than what you were, and making them revise that decision through the sheer weight of evidence. The difference this time was that the stakes were Gideon's ranch, his life's work, everything he had bought with everything he had when the world had looked at his face and told him he didn't belong in it. That made her more careful, not less. She packed the documents into a leather satchel, organized and secure, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Gideon was already there. He was standing at the stove, moving carefully. He was 3 weeks out from the bullet wound, and the ribs were healing, but not fully, and she'd learned to read the small adjustments he made in his movements to accommodate the pain he wasn't going to mention. He had dressed in his good clothes: dark trousers, a clean white shirt, a charcoal wool vest. He'd polished his boots. He looked like a man who understood that walking into a room sometimes requires preparation. He looked at the satchel under her arm. "Ready?" he said. "Since 4 this morning," she said. He almost smiled, poured her coffee without being asked. They rode to Cheyenne in the ranch wagon, Barnaby driving, the 3 of them sitting in relative silence as the early winter morning came up around them, pale and cold and clear after the storms of the past weeks. The road was frozen solid, the wagon moving fast and smooth over it. Stars were still out when they left. By the time the lights of Cheyenne appeared on the horizon, the sky had gone from black to dark blue to the thin gray of early dawn. The Cheyenne City Hall and Livestock Exchange was a 2-story wooden building on the main commercial street, new enough that the pine boards hadn't yet weathered to gray, with a wide-covered porch and a set of double doors that stood open despite the cold. Men were already moving in and out. Ranchers from across the territory, land agents, bank representatives, livestock buyers. Some of them she'd seen before at the depot or in passing during her previous trips to Cheyenne with Gideon. Most of them were strangers. She knew some of them knew her by reputation already. Word had spread through the ranching community about the woman at Broken Ridge. Some of what spread was accurate: the audit, the fraud discovery, the stable incident. Some of it was the kind of talk that attaches itself to a woman who does things men have decided aren't for women to do. She carried the satchel and walked through the double doors. The main hall was large and crowded, with rows of benches facing a raised platform at the far end. Along the left wall, a row of tables had been set up for the day's business transactions, mortgage filings, contract signings, formal proceedings. Several men sat at these tables with ledgers and paper, the functionaries of commerce doing their steady work. At the front of the room, near the platform, she saw him. Hector Rust. He was standing with two men she didn't recognize, both of them in city clothes, the kind worn by bank representatives or lawyers. He had a folder of papers under his arm and a smug, settled confidence in his posture that she recognized immediately as the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. He looked back. His expression shifted: surprise, then something harder, then the deliberate composition of a man reclaiming his advantage. He hadn't expected her to be here, or perhaps he had expected her and had decided it didn't matter. Either way, his response told her something useful. He was still underestimating her. Good. She moved to the registration table near the door and spoke to the clerk. Clementine Vance, representing Broken Ridge Ranch. I'm here to present a financial audit and a formal objection to any mortgage proceedings related to our property, and to present a government supply contract proposal. The clerk looked up at her. He was young, maybe 22, and he had the careful blankness of someone trained not to show reaction. He wrote her name in the register. You'll need to wait for the proceedings to open, he said. We begin at 9. I understand. She paused. I'd also like to speak with whoever is managing the mortgage auction specifically. I have documentation that's relevant to the validity of certain claims. The clerk looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and went to find someone. Gideon came to stand beside her. He saw you, he said quietly. How do you want to handle it? She looked at the room, at the benches filling up, the men at the transaction tables, the platform at the front, where the auction master was arranging his papers, at Hector and his 2 associates, who were now watching her with varying degrees of attention. I'm going to let the documents handle it, she said. That's what documents are for. At 5 minutes to 9, a man came toward her from the back of the room, older, heavy-set, with the solid authority of someone who had run these proceedings for years. He introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell, the auction administrator. She shook his hand and opened her satchel. I need 15 minutes before the mortgage proceedings, she said. I have evidence of fraud relating to certain claims against Broken Ridge Ranch that the administrator needs to see before any bids are accepted. Caldwell looked at the papers she placed in his hands. His eyes moved over the first page, then the second. His expression changed on the third. Where did you get these? He said. From the ranch's own financial files. I'm the bookkeeper and financial manager for Broken Ridge. These documents were found in the course of a standard audit. She laid 3 more pages on top. These are cross-referenced entries from the account books showing the specific transactions. And these 2 more pages are the correspondence files establishing the arrangement between Hector Rust and a proxy banking account in Cheyenne. Caldwell looked at the papers for a long moment. Then he looked at Hector across the room. Then he said, Excuse me for a moment. He walked toward the front of the room. The proceedings opened at 9 with a modification. Caldwell announced that there would be a formal review presentation before the mortgage auction portion of the morning. He indicated Clementine. The room looked at her. She walked to the front, set her satchel on the speaker's table, and faced the assembled men. There was a particular silence in a room where people are deciding whether to take you seriously. She had stood in that silence before. She knew what it felt like. She let it exist for exactly 2 seconds. Then she started talking. My name is Clementine Vance. I am the bookkeeper and financial manager of Broken Ridge Ranch, Fort Laramie District. Over the past 3 months, I have conducted a full audit of the ranch's financial records going back 4 years. What I found was systematic theft, fraud, and embezzlement conducted by the former foreman, Hector Rust, over a period of approximately 3.5 years. She placed the first document on the table in front of Caldwell, who was now seated with 2 other officials she'd identified as the county land registrar and a representative from the Cheyenne Bank. This is the summary audit. Total documented theft, $2,340. Circumstantially supported amount, closer to $3,000. She placed the next section. These are the forged invoices, cross-referenced against the actual delivery records, showing discrepancies in 47 separate transactions. Another section. These are the payroll ghost entries. 11 names paid over 18 months who do not appear in any other ranch record and cannot be corroborated by any staff member who worked the ranch during that period. Another, and these are the bank correspondence records, connecting payments from those transactions to a Cheyenne account under the name Harlan Cross. She looked up at the room. Harlan Cross is an alias. The account was opened with documentation that included a description matching Hector Rust in every particular. I have included the original account opening record, which the Cheyenne Bank provided to the county sheriff's office last week. The room was very quiet. She kept going. The mortgage claims against Broken Ridge Ranch that are scheduled for auction today are built on a financial picture deliberately distorted by this fraud. The ranch's actual financial position, adjusted for the theft, is significantly stronger than the claim documents suggest. I have prepared a corrected financial statement here. She placed the final section in front of Caldwell. The ranch is not in default. It has been made to appear in default through the falsification of its accounts. She paused. I would ask that the mortgage proceedings be suspended pending a full review of this evidence. And I would ask that Mr. Hector Rust, who is present in this room, be detained for questioning. Every head in the room turned toward Hector. Hector stood up. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. In the stable and the barn and the blizzard, he had always had some version of confidence, the settled assurance of a man who believed his own advantage was structural, built into the world around him, permanent. Now that expression was gone. What was under it was much simpler and much more human. Fear. These are fabrications, he said. His voice was steady but too fast. She's been working to undermine my position on that ranch since she arrived. This is retaliation. These documents are Mr. Rust. Caldwell's voice was flat. Sit down. Hector sat. One of the officials beside Caldwell was already writing something. Another was leafing through the audit summary with the focused attention of a man who knew what he was reading. Clementine picked up her satchel. There's one more item, she said. She removed the final folder. Broken Ridge Ranch's horse breeding program. We have been developing a strategic breeding operation over the past 3 months, centered on a registered quarter horse sire of documented lineage. I have prepared a formal proposal for a government supply contract working horses for the territorial army posts in the region. She opened the folder. The projected output, the price per head, the delivery schedule, and the ranch's capacity to fulfill the contract are all detailed here. I presented a preliminary version of this program to the Army Supply Officer at Fort Laramie. 2 weeks ago, he indicated strong interest and has sent a recommendation letter, which is included in this package. She set the folder in front of Caldwell. Broken Ridge Ranch is not a failing operation in need of rescue, she said. It is a sound operation that was being systematically robbed. The difference between those two things is significant, and the evidence in front of you makes that difference clear. She picked up her empty satchel and stepped back. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Caldwell said, "The mortgage proceedings are suspended pending review." He nodded to the man beside him. "Get the sheriff." They took Hector Rust out of the Cheyenne City Hall and Livestock Exchange at 10:15 in the morning. One deputy on each side of him, his folder of papers left behind on the bench where he'd been sitting. He didn't look at Clementine as he passed. She watched him go. Gideon was standing against the wall near the door. He'd been there the whole time, still watching. When she came to stand beside him, he looked at her for a moment. "The supply contract," he said. "Fort Laramie sent a recommendation letter 2 weeks ago," she said. "I didn't mention it because you were still recovering, and I didn't want you to do anything strenuous out of excitement." He looked at her. "That's a significant development," he said. "I know. You were to tell me when?" "Today seemed like the right time," she said. Outside the window, the Cheyenne morning was bright and cold and clear, and Hector Rust was walking to the county jail, and the mortgage proceedings against Broken Ridge Ranch were suspended, and the government supply contract proposal was sitting in front of the county administrator with a recommendation letter from Fort Laramie. Barnaby, who had been sitting in the back of the room throughout the whole proceeding, appeared at her other elbow. "Coffee," he said, and handed her a tin cup. She took it. "Thank you, Barnaby," she said. "You did good," he said simply, and went back to the wagon. The celebration at Broken Ridge happened on a Saturday. It was Barnaby's idea, which surprised nobody who knew him well, because Barnaby had opinions about marking occasions correctly and the patience to execute them. He'd spent 2 days quietly organizing, requisitioning provisions from the Cheyenne General Store, recruiting the ranch hands for specific tasks, and conducting the entire operation with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything else. By Saturday afternoon, the yard at Broken Ridge was transformed. Long tables had been set up outside the main house, covered with whatever clean cloth could be found. A fire was going in the yard's stone pit. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread came from the kitchen, where 2 women from the neighboring settlement had been persuaded to help for the day. Someone had found a fiddle, and the young red-haired hand, whose name was Porter, turned out to be unexpectedly talented with it. The hands were all there. 8 of them now, the roster refilled after Hector's departure with men Gideon had hired himself, men he knew by reputation or by direct work history, men who met the standard he'd always held the ranch to. They'd been told what the celebration was for, and they were pleased about it in the uncomplicated way of people who have watched a wrong being righted. People from the surrounding ranches came too. Word had spread about the Cheyenne auction and what Clementine had done there. Some of them were curious. Some were genuinely glad. A few of the women from the settlement had become something approaching friendly with her over the past weeks, drawn initially by the horse program and its practical implications for their own operations, and then by the simple fact of spending time with someone whose mind worked the way hers did. Clementine stood on the porch of the main house in the afternoon light and watched all of it with a quiet satisfaction she wasn't trying to contain or manage. This was hers, too. This place, this work, these people. She had earned every square inch of it. She had on her best dress a deep green wool she'd brought from Philadelphia, and save for occasions, she hadn't known yet what they would be. She'd done her hair properly, which took time but was worth it. She felt like herself. Precisely herself. No smaller, no apologized for. Just exactly who she was, in a place where that was enough. Gideon came out of the house behind her. He was in his good clothes again, the dark wool vest, the white shirt. He'd shaved that morning. The scar on his face caught the afternoon light and was, as it had always been, simply part of his face. She had stopped thinking of it as something separate from him a long time ago. He stood beside her and looked at the yard. "Good crowd," he said. "Barnaby is very persuasive," she said. "Barnaby is relentless," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. He was watching the yard with an expression she'd come to know well. The contained warmth of a man who felt things deeply and showed it in degrees, not all at once. "Are you ready?" she said. "I've been ready for a while," he said. "I was waiting for the right moment." She looked at him more carefully. He was looking back at her now. "Come on," he said. He took her hand and led her down the porch steps into the yard. Barnaby, who had been watching from near the fire pit, said something to Porter, who stopped playing the fiddle. The yard quieted. The hands turned. The neighbors and settlement women paused in their conversations. Gideon led Clementine to the center of the yard and let go of her hand. He reached into his vest pocket and took out a folded paper. He held it, looked at it for a moment, then looked out at the assembled people. "Most of you know what happened in Cheyenne last week," he said. His voice was clear and unhurried, carrying across the yard without effort. "And most of you know why we're celebrating today. But I want to say something before we eat and before we make this official." He paused. "This ranch has been standing since 1879. Everything I've built here, every fence post, every head of cattle, every improvement on this land I built because I believed that a place could be run on simple principles. Work hard, treat people fairly, measure a person by what they do, not by what they look like." He looked around the yard. "I haven't always managed to hold to that perfectly, but I've tried." Another pause. 3 months ago, a woman arrived at Broken Ridge who had been sent here under false pretenses by people who thought less of her than she deserved. She was treated badly from the first day. She was given work designed to humiliate her. She stood in the hot sun for 2 hours before anyone showed her basic courtesy. He looked at Clementine. She didn't break. She didn't leave. She went into the office that first evening and started fixing what was broken. He unfolded the paper. She found 3 years of theft in 3 days. She saved a prized horse from poisoning in the middle of the night. She walked back through a blizzard and kept me alive in a cave with no tools and one box of matches. He stopped. "Let that sit for a moment." And then she walked into the Cheyenne City Hall in her best dress and dismantled a fraud scheme in front of a room full of men who had never seen her before, and secured a government contract that changes the future of this ranch. He held the paper out toward her. "This is a deed," he said. 50% ownership of Broken Ridge Ranch, signed over to Clementine Vance. Not as a gift, not as thanks, as recognition of what is already true." He looked out at the yard. "She is a full partner in this operation. Equal in all decisions, equal in all proceeds, equal in all responsibilities." He looked back at the assembled people, hands and neighbors alike. A real man isn't defined by how much he controls, but by whether he has the strength to stand beside a brilliant woman as his equal. On this ranch, character and competence are the only measures of a person. He looked at Clementine directly. That was true the day she got here. "I'm just making it official." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Barnaby began to clap. Slow, deliberate, the way he did everything without performance, but with complete intention. Porter joined him, then the other hands, then the neighbors, until the yard was full of it, rising in the cold November air. Clementine took the deed from his hands. She looked at the figures and the legal language and her own name written in the official lines of the document, clear and permanent, the way facts become real when you put them on paper. She looked at Gideon. He was watching her with that quiet warmth. "Thank you?" she said. "Don't thank me," he said, which was what he always said. But this time he was smiling when he said it. A full, real smile, one of the few she'd seen from him, and it changed his whole face. She folded the deed carefully and held it. Then Barnaby said, "There's more," in a tone that managed to be both casual and pointed at once. Gideon looked at him. "You might as well," Barnaby said. Gideon looked at the yard. At the hands watching, at the neighbors watching, at Porter with his fiddle under his arm, looking interested. He looked at Clementine. Then he reached into his other vest pocket. He went down on one knee. The yard was completely silent. He held up a simple gold band. No flourish, no speech. He looked up at her with all the directness and plainness that was simply his nature, and he said, "Clementine Vance, I would be honored to be your husband, if you'll have me." She looked at him. She looked at the ring. She looked at his face, the scar, the steady dark eyes, the man who had ridden into a yard and roared at the top of his lungs that she belonged, who had built her a saddle that fit her exactly right, who had sat beside her in a stable all night and asked her about horses, who had let her tell him the truth about her father, and told her the truth about his scar, who had said, "Take up space," and meant every word. Yes, she said, simple, clear the way she stated facts. He slid the ring onto her finger and stood up, and she was laughing, which surprised her, and he was still smiling, and Barnaby started clapping again, and Porter broke into something fast and celebratory on the fiddle, and the yard erupted. She held his hand and looked at the ring and looked at the yard and looked at the wide Wyoming sky above Broken Ridge Ranch, which was now half hers, and felt the full, unmanaged, uncontained weight of something she had not let herself want for a long time. She was home, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she had chosen this place and it had chosen her back, and that was entirely different. Gideon leaned close to her ear. "The breeding program projections for next year," he said. "I had some questions." She burst out laughing again, fully and completely. "Tonight," she said. "Tonight," he agreed, and led her toward the tables and the fire and the music and the people who were, in the truest sense, their people now. 5 years passed. Wyoming changed in those 5 years. The railroad pushed further north. New settlements appeared on land that had been open range. The territorial government made decisions that affected every rancher in the Fort Laramie district, some good, some frustrating, all of them requiring navigation. The winters were hard. The summers were dry. These things were not news to anyone who lived in this country. They were simply the conditions, the way that working land always has conditions, and you work with them, or you don't work at all. Broken Ridge Ranch not only survived, it grew. The government horse supply contract that Clementine had secured in the Cheyenne auction hall had been renewed twice, each time at a higher volume. The breeding program had produced 3 full foal classes now, and the reputation of Broken Ridge stock had spread through the territory in the specific way that genuine quality spreads quietly, and by word of mouth, one satisfied buyer telling 2 ranchers, who told 4 more. The waiting list for Copper's offspring was 8 names long. The cattle operation had been restructured and was profitable in a way it hadn't been under Hector's management, now that every dollar went where it was supposed to go. Clementine reviewed the books monthly, prepared quarterly reports, and had established a supplier approval process so airtight that no fraudulent invoice could survive its first examination. Hector Rust had spent the last 4 years in the Cheyenne County Jail on charges that included fraud, embezzlement, arson, assault, and conspiracy. His trial had been brief. The evidence was thorough. The main house at Broken Ridge had been added on to a proper second bedroom, a larger kitchen, an office with 2 desks where Clementine and Gideon sometimes worked in parallel in the evenings, him going over land records whilst she worked the account books, the fire going, the ranch quiet around them. They had been married in the spring of 1889 in a small ceremony in the yard at Broken Ridge, performed by the circuit preacher and attended by every hand on the ranch, Barnaby as witness, and a collection of neighbors whose feelings about the match had universally evolved from curious to admiring in the months between Gideon's proposal and the actual wedding. Barnaby himself was slower now than he had been. 72 years old by his own uncertain accounting, and he moved with more deliberation. and less of that silent material appearance that had characterized his first years on the ranch. But his eyes were the same deep-set, steady, missing nothing. He still appeared with coffee at precisely the right moment. He had simply reduced his radius somewhat, staying closer to the buildings, spending more time in the breeding stables. With a particular interest in the new foals that Clementine suspected was as personal as it was professional. He had taken on, in the last 2 years, a different role at Broken Ridge. He was teaching. It had started small. The women began arriving the same way. Clementine had arrived by stagecoach, by wagon, by word of mouth passed through the network of settlements and employment agencies that stretched across the territory. Young women who needed work and a new start. Women who had been told too many times by too many people what they were worth and had begun to believe it. Broken Ridge received them. It had been Clementine's proposal, 2 years into their marriage, sitting at her desk with the books in good order and the ranch on solid footing, and an awareness growing in her that what she had built here was replicable, that other women could have what she had found, not the same story, not the same person waiting at the end of it, but the same foundation, real work, real compensation, real dignity. She'd sat across from Gideon at dinner and laid it out the way she laid out any proposal. Clearly, with numbers, with a realistic assessment of what it would cost and what it would return. He had listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "When do we start?" They had started the following spring. Now, Broken Ridge operated a household and ranch training program for women seeking employment in the West. Bookkeeping, horse management, domestic organization, basic veterinary care, and financial literacy taught in a structured program that combined classroom work in the evenings with practical ranch work during the day. The women who came lived in a proper dormitory that had been built onto the east side of the bunkhouse, separate and private, with their own cooking facilities, and a sitting room that Clementine had stocked with every practical text she could order from Denver and Cheyenne. Barnaby was the primary instructor for horsework. He was, it turned out, a gifted teacher, patient, consistent, demanding in the right measure, never cruel. He taught the way he did everything else without performance, with complete attention, repeating what needed, repeating without frustration, adjusting his approach for each student without changing his standards. The women adored him. He seemed both surprised by this and quietly delighted. The program had placed 11 women in ranch positions across the territory in 2 years. 3 of them had started businesses of their own. One had a horse training operation near Laramie that was already turning a profit in its first season. Clementine tracked all of them in a separate ledger. She knew their names, their starting points, their current circumstances. She wrote to several of them regularly and received letters back that she kept in a box on her office shelf. The particular satisfying weight of evidence that something you'd built was working. On a Tuesday morning in November, 5 years to the month from her arrival at the Cheyenne Depot, she was in the yard when Barnaby came out of the main house with the Morning Post. "Stage brought something this morning," he said, and handed her a letter. She opened it. It was from the Fort Laramie Supply Office, a contract renewal. Larger than the previous one, she folded it and put it in her pocket and looked out at the ranch. The breeding stables were being cleaned. 2 of the program women were in the corral, working a young horse under Barnaby's direction. The smell of bread from the kitchen came on the cold morning air. Gideon was somewhere out on the north fence line, where they'd been extending the pasture boundary all week. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the road from Cheyenne, a stagecoach in the distance, moving up the approach road, kicking dust in the dry winter air. She watched it come. It pulled up at the north gate. The driver climbed down. 1 passenger. A young woman stepped off the coach onto the Broken Ridge Road. She was heavyset, young, maybe 20 or 21, in a traveling dress that had seen 3 days of hard road. Her hair was coming loose from its pins. She had a large trunk at her feet that the driver had set down without offering to help further. She was looking at the ranch buildings with an expression that Clementine recognized from the inside. Uncertainty. Hope? The terrifying combination of needing something and not yet knowing if you were allowed to want it. The young woman saw Clementine watching her. She straightened up slightly. She squared her shoulders the way people do when they're trying to look capable. Clementine walked toward her. Behind her, she heard the screen door of the main house. Barnaby coming out onto the porch, leaning against the post with his coffee, watching. She reached the young woman at the gate. She looked at her, at the tired face and the hopeful eyes, and the too heavy trunk the driver had abandoned, and she bent down and picked up that trunk herself. Both hands. Solid grip. She straightened and looked at the young woman directly. "I'm Clementine Thorne," she said. "Welcome to Broken Ridge." She paused and let a small, warm smile come. "Here, you get to choose your own path." The young woman looked at her. Then her shoulders came down from where she'd been holding them, that careful, rigid posture of someone braced for the worst, and she let out a long breath. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Clementine said. "The bookkeeping program starts Monday morning, and I don't accept incomplete work." She started walking toward the house. "Come inside. There's coffee." The young woman picked up her smaller bag and followed. Barnaby held the door. Inside, the main house was warm. The fire was going in the front room. Clementine set the trunk down in the entry and led the young woman toward the kitchen. And through the window, she could see the ranch in the clear November light, the stables, the corrals, the wide pasture land where two of the mares were moving, the long fence line running north toward the hills, and somewhere out there, Gideon. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of her guest and wrapped her hands around her own and looked out the window at Broken Ridge Ranch. Her ranch, her work, her home, and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 5 years ago in the Cheyenne heat, with nothing but a leather satchel, a pocket ledger, and the absolute refusal to be less than what she was. She thought about how dignity is not given. It is kept, held onto through the things that try to take it, and offered forward when you have the chance. She thought about Gideon's voice in a yard full of watching people. "Not on my ranch." She thought about his hands building her a saddle. The cave in the blizzard, the gold ring, 2 desks in 1 office. She thought about 11 women across Wyoming, working, building, choosing their own paths. And she thought about this young woman sitting across from her, holding her coffee with both hands, already looking more at ease than she had at the gate, already watching the window with a particular attention that Clementine recognized as the first sign of curiosity replacing fear. Curiosity was where everything good began. "What's your experience with numbers?" Clementine asked. The young woman looked at her. My father kept a shop. I did the tallies on Fridays." "Good." Clementine pulled a ledger from the shelf beside her and set it on the table between them. "Then you have a foundation. We build from there." Outside, the November sun moved across Wyoming in that slow, clear way it does in winter, touching the ridge above the South Valley and the roof of the main house and the wide, turning blades of the windmill near the east well, making everything briefly gold before settling toward the long blue shadow of afternoon. Broken Ridge Ranch stood in it, solid earned, built by hard work and straight accounting, and the particular courage it takes to refuse what the world says you are, and insist, through every action of every day, on what you actually are. That was the legacy. Not just the land records, or the breeding program, or the contract renewals, or the women placed in good work across the territory. The legacy was this: that a place could be built where the measure of a person was their character and their competence, where dignity was not conditional on what you looked like or where you came from, where the door opened because you knocked and not because someone had decided in advance you deserved it. That was what Clementine Vance had walked into a broken-down ranch office and built 1 column of figures at a time. and it would last. She was absolutely certain of that. She turned back to the young woman and began to teach. There is something this story keeps coming back to, quietly, in every chapter, and it is worth saying out loud before we go. Clementine Vance arrived in Wyoming with nothing the world considered valuable. She was not thin, she was not connected. She had no family left who claimed her, and no city that wanted her. She had a pocket ledger, a pen, and a mind that could find the truth in any column of numbers anyone put in front of her. The world told her that wasn't enough. The world told her she was too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. And for a long time, she believed it not completely, but enough to pull her shoulders in, keep her voice down, and make herself smaller than she was. What Broken Ridge gave her was not charity. It was not rescue. Gideon Thorne did not swoop in and fix her. What he did, and what the ranch itself did, and Barnaby, and the work, and the Wyoming sky, was simply refuse to participate in the lie. He looked at her and saw a bookkeeper. He saw a woman who could read the truth out of a set of falsified accounts in 3 days. He saw someone who would walk back through a blizzard to save a man she loved and build a fire with 11 matches in a rock shelter and face down a room full of skeptical businessmen with nothing but documented evidence and a straight spine. He saw what was actually there, and that is the lesson that stays. Not the romance, though the romance is real and earned and completely worth rooting for. The deeper lesson is this: the way other people see you is not the same thing as what you are. It never was. Clementine spent years trying to earn the right to take up space in rooms that were never going to give her that permission, because rooms like that don't give permission. They withhold it. They make you perform and diminish and shrink, and when you've made yourself small enough, they still find another reason. The answer is not to perform harder. The answer is to stop asking. Do the work. Know what you know. Keep your ledger straight. Walk into the office and find the room that needs you most, and get to work before anyone tells you that you're allowed to. Because competence is not something anyone can take away from you, and integrity is not granted by committee, and the people worth knowing, the Gideons, the Barnabys, the Porters who look away when cruelty is happening, and eventually learn better, those people will recognize what you are when they see it in action. There is also something in this story about what real strength looks like in a man. Gideon Thorne had every reason to perform toughness. He had a face that scared children and made strangers cross the street. He was the owner of 2,000 acres and a working cattle operation, and he could have run that place any way he chose. And what he chose was this: he chose fairness. He chose to look at a woman and see her qualifications. He chose to build her a saddle that fit her instead of expecting her to reshape herself to fit the one that was available. He chose to stand in front of his crew and say, plainly and on the record, that a real man's measure is not how much he controls, but whether he has the strength to stand beside a brilliant woman as her equal. That is not weakness. That is the hardest and most genuinely powerful thing a person in authority can do: use that authority to level the ground rather than to hold it tilted. If this story meant something to you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are the person who needs to hear it, if you are standing in a yard somewhere, in the full sun, being told you belong in the dirt, pick up the stone. Keep working. The hoofbeats are coming. This story is a work of historical fiction created for entertainment and inspirational purposes. All characters, events, and dialogue are entirely fictional and do not represent any real individuals or actual historical occurrences.